From a cup of hemlock in ancient Athens to a secret firing squad in modern Iraq, this is a calm yet fascinating journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with why Athens put its wisest teacher on trial and move deeper into why a 20th century thinker paid with his life for new ideas. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Socrates. The Hemlock question. Picture Athens in 399 BCE. The city that had once ruled the Mediterranean was nursing wounds that would never fully heal. The Peloponnesian War had ended 27 years earlier, but its ghost still wandered the agora. Where once there had been confidence in Athenian exceptionalism, now there was only the bitter taste of defeat and the uncomfortable question of what had gone wrong. The old certainties were crumbling. Traditional religion felt hollow to many, especially the young who had grown up hearing stories of gods who seemed absent during their city's darkest hours. Democratic institutions, once the pride of Athens, had proven fragile. Remember, this was the same democracy that had briefly been overthrown by the 30 tyrants. The very foundations of Athenian society were shifting beneath everyone's feet like sand in an earthquake. Into this atmosphere of anxiety and cultural upheaval stepped the charges against Socrates. The formal accusations were straightforward enough: impiety against the gods of the city and corrupting the youth. But anyone who understood the political climate knew these charges carried far more weight than their simple words suggested. Socrates had become a symbol of everything that made traditional Athenians uncomfortable about their changing world. The courtroom drama of the Apology, that masterpiece of philosophical literature we still read today, was really a clash between two worldviews. On one side stood the accusers, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, representing the desire to return to simpler times when everyone knew their place and questioned nothing. On the other side was Socrates, 70 years old, calmly explaining why the unexamined life was not worth living. What strikes you most about Socrates' defense isn't its legal sophistication, it's his complete refusal to play the game. He doesn't weep, doesn't bring his children forward to elicit sympathy, doesn't promise to change his ways. Instead, he doubles down. He tells the jury that far from corrupting anyone, he's actually been doing Athens a service by questioning everything and everyone. He compares himself to a gadfly, stinging the lazy horse of Athenian complacency into action. The hubris is breathtaking, really. Here's a man on trial for his life, and he's essentially telling his judges they should be thanking him. He even suggests that instead of death, he should be given free meals for life as a public benefactor. It's the kind of performance that makes you wonder if he was genuinely trying to save himself, or if he'd already made peace with whatever verdict awaited him. The jury wasn't amused. By a margin of just 30 votes out of 500, they found him guilty. But then something fascinating happened. According to Athenian law, Socrates could propose an alternative to the death penalty. This was his chance to save himself with exile or a fine. Instead, he offered to pay 30 minae, deliberately insulting amount that everyone knew he couldn't afford. In the end, the same jury that had barely convicted him voted overwhelmingly for death. They'd given him every opportunity to save himself, and he'd thrown it back in their faces. The message was clear. Some principles are worth dying for, and the right to ask uncomfortable questions was one of them. The 30 days that followed were perhaps the most philosophically rich of Socrates' life. Athenian law required that executions be delayed during certain religious festivals, and so Socrates found himself with a month to contemplate his approaching death. His friends gathered around him in prison, and these conversations became the material for Plato's most profound dialogues. The discussions that took place in that dank cell were about nothing less than the nature of existence itself. What happens when we die? Is the soul immortal? Should we fear death? Or is it perhaps the greatest adventure of all? Socrates approached these ultimate questions with the same methodical curiosity he'd brought to everything else. Death, he reasoned, was either like a dreamless sleep, in which case, what could be more peaceful? Or it was a journey to another place, where he could continue asking questions of Homer, Hesiod, and all the great figures of the past. The image of Socrates in his final hours has become one of the most powerful in all of Western literature. When the time came, he bathed so that his body would be clean for burial, small act of consideration for those who would have to prepare his corpse. He said goodbye to his wife Xanthippe and his 3 sons, sending them away so that his final moments could be spent in philosophical conversation with his closest friends. The executioner, almost apologetically, brought the cup of hemlock. Socrates took it without hesitation, drank it down as if it were wine, and then began to walk around the cell until his legs grew heavy. He lay down, and gradually the coldness crept up his body. His last words, according to Plato, were about a debt to the god of healing. "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please, don't forget to pay the debt." What did he mean? Scholars have debated this for centuries. Perhaps he was saying that death was a cure for the disease of life. Or maybe it was simply a reminder that even in dying, our obligations to others continue. The ambiguity is perfect a final question from the man who had spent his life asking them. The execution of Socrates became a defining moment in the history of human thought. Here was a man who had chosen death over intellectual compromise, who had preferred the hemlock to silence. Every subsequent philosopher who faced persecution could look back to that prison cell in Athens and know they weren't alone. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Socrates' death is how it transformed defeat into victory. Athens thought it was silencing a troublesome questioner. Instead, it created a martyr whose influence would outlast the very civilization that condemned him. The questions Socrates asked about virtue, knowledge, and the good life didn't die with him. They became the foundation of Western philosophy itself. Today, more than 2 millennia later, we still invoke Socrates whenever intellectual freedom comes under attack. His death reminds us that some things are worth dying for, and that the right to question authority, whether political, religious, or intellectualis, one of humanity's most precious possessions. The hemlock may have stopped his heart, but it could never silence the questions he taught us to ask. Polemarchus, a logician, caught in civil terror. If Socrates' execution was a clash between philosophy and tradition, then the death of Polemarchus was something far more brutal. The simple elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to power. The year was 404 BCE, and Athens was about to learn that sometimes the cure for democracy's problems can be worse than the disease itself. The 30 tyrants, though they certainly didn't call themselves that, had come to power with the backing of Sparta after Athens' final defeat in the Peloponnesian War. These were men who genuinely believed that democracy had been Athens' downfall, that the city's problems stemmed from giving too much power to the unwashed masses. Their solution was elegantly simple. Strip citizenship from all but 3,000 of the wealthiest men, and let those select few govern as they saw fit. Polemarchus had the misfortune of being exactly the kind of person this new regime found threatening. He was wealthy, yes, but he was also a Metica resident alien, which meant he could never fully belong to any political faction. More dangerously, he was an intellectual, the kind of man who asked probing questions about justice and power. We know him today primarily because he appears in the opening of Plato's Republic, engaging in the very sort of philosophical discussion that made the 30 nervous. The irony is almost too perfect. In Plato's dialogue, Polemarchus argues that justice means giving people what they deserve, helping friends, and harming enemies. It's a conventional enough view, but Socrates systematically dismantles it, showing how this understanding of justice can lead to terrible consequences. Reading it now, knowing what happened to Polemarchus, you can't help but wonder if Plato was trying to show us something about the difference between theoretical discussions of justice and its brutal reality. The knock on the door came at his home in Piraeus, Athens' port district. Polemarchus had been going about his normal business. He was involved in the family's successful shield-making enterprise. When the agents of the 30 arrived, there was no formal arrest, no reading of charges, no opportunity for defense. This was the new Athens, where efficiency had replaced due process. What happened next reveals everything about the nature of tyranny. Polemarchus was not executed because he had committed any specific crime. He was killed because he possessed wealth that the 30 wanted to confiscate, and because his very existence represented a form of moderation that had no place in their polarized world. The 30 had divided Athens into two categories: those who supported them completely and enemies to be eliminated. The execution itself was swift and businesslike. There was no trial, no opportunity for last words, no chance for family members to plead for mercy. Polemarchus was simply taken away and killed, his body dumped somewhere in the city. Even his funeral became a political act. The 30 forbade his family from holding it in their own home, forcing them to use hired facilities as if he were a common criminal. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Polemarchus's death was how it fitted into the broader pattern of the 30's reign. They weren't content with simply eliminating their political opponents. They systematically targeted anyone who might serve as a rallying point for resistance. Wealthy metics like Polemarchus were particularly vulnerable because they had resources but no political rights, making them easy targets for confiscation. The family's attempts to save him tell us something important about how terror works. Polemarchus's brothers and relatives tried everything they could think: off appeals to connections, offers of bribes, desperate pleas for mercy. But they were operating under the old rules, where personal relationships and negotiation still mattered. The 30 had created a new reality where such considerations were irrelevant. What makes Polemarchus's death particularly tragic is how it represents the silencing of moderate voices during times of political crisis. He wasn't a radical democrat or a revolutionary. He was exactly the kind of thoughtful citizen who might have helped Athens find a middle path between the extremes of mob rule and tyranny. But extremism has no use for moderation, and the 30 understood that eliminating reasonable people like Polemarchus was essential to maintaining their grip on power. The broader context makes his death even more sobering. The 30 killed about 1,500 people during their brief reign, roughly 5% of Athens' citizen body. Most of these victims were not dangerous revolutionaries or hardened criminals. They were ordinary people whose only crime was possessing something the 30 wanted or representing values the new regime found threatening. Polemarchus's death also illustrates how political violence creates its own momentum. Each execution made the next one easier, each confiscation more routine. What began as a targeted elimination of genuine threats soon expanded to include anyone who might potentially become a threat, and then anyone who simply possessed something the regime wanted. The philosophical implications are profound. Here was a man who had spent time thinking about justice, participating in the kind of reasoned discussion that Socrates believed was essential to human flourishing. The 30's message was clear. Such discussions were not just useless, but dangerous. In their view, justice was whatever served the state's interests, and the state's interests were whatever the 30 said they were. When the 30 were finally overthrown in 403 BCE, the restored democracy tried to move forward through amnesty and reconciliation. But the damage had been done. The execution of men like Polemarchus had shown how quickly a civilized society could descend into brutality, how easily the rule of law could be swept aside by those who confused might with right. The lesson of Polemarchus's death resonates through history. When political systems collapse, it's often the reasonable voices that suffer most. Extremists at least understand each other's logic, even when they're mortal enemies. But moderates represent something that fanatics of all stripes find intolerable: the possibility that complex problems might not have simple solutions, that political opponents might not be evil, that governing might require compromise rather than coercion. In the end, Polemarchus died not for any grand philosophical principle, but simply for being the kind of person who made authoritarianism difficult. His death reminds us that protecting democratic institutions isn't just about preventing coups or stolen elections. It's about preserving the space for thoughtful people to ask uncomfortable questions about power and justice. When that space disappears, even the most reasonable voices become dangerous to those who rule through fear. Shang reformer in chains. The state of Qin in 338 BCE was experiencing the kind of crisis that either destroys a civilization or transforms it completely. For centuries, China had been fragmenting into warring kingdoms, each claiming to be the legitimate heir to the ancient Zhou dynasty. Traditional solutions appeals to moral virtue, respect for ancient customs, the benevolent rule of philosopher Kingshad, proven spectacularly inadequate. What was needed was something entirely new, something that would sacrifice everything familiar for the promise of effectiveness. Enter Shang, a man whose name would become synonymous with both brilliant reform and terrifying ruthlessness. Born Yang, he acquired the title Shang from his fiefdom, but he might as well have been called Revolution for all the upheaval he brought to Qin society. His philosophy was deceptively simple. Human nature is fundamentally selfish and must be controlled through harsh laws and generous rewards. Morality was a luxury that weak states couldn't afford. The reforms he implemented were breathtaking in their scope and audacity. He abolished the old aristocratic system that had governed China for centuries, replacing it with a meritocracy based on military achievement and agricultural production. Noble birth meant nothing in the new Qin. What mattered was how many enemy heads you could deliver to the state or how much grain you could produce. Social mobility became possible, but only through service to the collective good as defined by the government. The legal system Shang created was perhaps the most sophisticated instrument of social control the world had yet seen. Every crime had a specific punishment. Every punishment was carried out without exception, and every citizen was responsible for monitoring their neighbor's behavior. The famous mutual responsibility system meant that if one person committed a crime, their entire group faced consequences. It was a system that turned surveillance into a civic duty and made private morality a public concern. But perhaps most revolutionary was Shang Yang's approach to warfare. Where other states still conducted military campaigns like elaborate aristocratic games, Qin transformed war into industrial production. Soldiers were rewarded based on body counts, officers promoted based on victories, and the entire society was organized to support military efficiency. The result was an army that fought with a ferocity that terrified their enemies, and a state that could sustain military operations far beyond what traditional kingdoms could manage. The reforms worked spectacularly. Within a generation, Qin had gone from being a backward frontier state to the most powerful kingdom in China. Their armies were feared throughout the known world. Their administration was more efficient than anything their rivals could imagine, and their economic productivity was the envy of neighboring states. By every measurable standard, Shang Yang's revolution had been a complete success. But success in creating an efficient state machine came with a terrible price. The same legal system that had transformed Qin into a powerhouse was utterly merciless to those who ran afoul of it. There was no room for discretion, no allowance for circumstances, no recognition that laws created for one purpose might be inappropriate for another. The system Shang Yang had built was like a perfectly designed trap, beautiful in its efficiency, deadly in its operation. The trap finally closed on its creator in 338 BCE, when Duke Xiao died and was succeeded by his son, who had never forgiven Shang Yang for an earlier punishment. The new ruler, Duke Huaiwen, immediately issued orders for Shang Yang's arrest on charges of treason. The specific accusations were almost irrelevant in a system where any opposition to the ruler's will was by definition treasonous. The charges were merely a formality. What followed was a masterpiece of cosmic irony. Shang Yang, fleeing the capital, sought refuge at a roadside inn. But his own laws required innkeepers to examine travelers' identification papers, and anyone found harboring a fugitive faced severe punishment. The innkeeper, not recognizing the architect of the very system that now trapped him, turned Shang away. He was forced to flee to the countryside, where he tried to organize resistance using his own fiefdom as a base. The rebellion was brief and hopeless. Shang Yang's reforms had created a state machine too efficient to be overthrown by individual action, no matter how brilliant the individual might be. His forces were crushed, and he was captured and brought back to the capital for punishment. The trial, such as it was conducted according to the legal procedures he had established, swift, impartial, and utterly without mercy. The execution method chosen for Shang Yang was carting, being torn apart by horses pulling in opposite directions. It was one of the most brutal punishments in the legal code he had written, reserved for the most serious crimes against the state. The symbolism was intentional. The man who had created the system would be destroyed by it in the most agonizing way possible. But the cruelty didn't end with Shang Yang's death. In accordance with his own laws about collective punishment, his entire family was executed. His wife, his children, his servants all paid the price for his treason. The very principle of mutual responsibility that had made his reforms so effective now ensured that his bloodline would be completely extinguished. The paradox of Shang Yang's fate became a touchstone for Chinese political thought. Here was a man who had created a legal system so perfect in its logic that it had transformed a backward state into a regional superpower. Yet that same system, operating exactly as designed, had destroyed its creator without a trace of injustice, according to its own standards. The laws were working perfectly. It was just that perfect laws could be perfectly terrible. The immediate aftermath of Shang Yang's execution revealed the full extent of his achievement. Du Kuaiwen, despite his personal hatred for the man, made no attempt to reverse the reforms. He couldn't. They had become too essential to Qin's survival. The administrative system, the legal code, the military organization, the economic policies all remained in place. Shang Yang was dead, but his revolution lived on. This created a peculiar situation where a man was simultaneously honored and reviled by the same state. Later Qin rulers would praise Shang Yang's reforms while condemning his person, celebrating his achievements while justifying his execution. He became a ghost in the machine he had created, essential but unmentionable, foundational but forbidden. The broader implications of Shang Yang's death extended far beyond Qin. His fate became a warning about the dangers of creating systems more powerful than their creators, of building institutions that operate without regard for human judgment or compassion. The very efficiency that made his reforms successful also made them dangerous to anyone who might fall afoul of them. Yet history vindicated Shang Yang's methods, if not his person. The state he had created would eventually conquer all of China under the first emperor, establishing systems of government that would influence Chinese civilization for over 2 millennia. The legal principles he had established, the administrative methods he had developed, the military strategies he had pioneered all became part of the foundation of imperial China. The execution of Shang Yang thus represents one of history's most perfect examples of tragic irony. A man destroyed by his own creation, a reformer consumed by his own reforms, a legal genius executed by his own laws. His death reminds us that the systems we create to serve us can easily become our masters, and that the price of perfect efficiency might be the destruction of everything human about governance. In the end, Shang Yang achieved a kind of immortality through his death, not the comfortable immortality of honored memory, but the terrible immortality of having his name forever associated with the dangers of putting systematic logic above human compassion. He created a machine that worked perfectly, and it worked perfectly even when it was killing him. Han Fei, voice of legalism, muzzled. History has a way of creating perfect ironies, and few are more perfect than the fate of Han Fei. the man who articulated the philosophy that would shape Chinese imperial government for over 2,000 years, only to become its first prominent victim. Born into the aristocracy of the state of Han, around 280 BCE, Han Fei suffered from a severe stutter that made public speaking nearly impossible. Perhaps it was this physical limitation that drove him to perfect his thoughts on paper, creating some of the most influential political writings in human history. The world Han Fei inhabited was one of constant warfare and shifting alliances. The Warring States period was reaching its climax, and it was becoming clear that only one kingdom would survive to unify China. Traditional Confucian ideals about virtuous rulers and moral government seemed quaint in an age when survival depended on military efficiency and administrative competence. What was needed, Han Fei believed, was a completely new approach to statecraft based on realistic assessments of human nature rather than wishful thinking about human virtue. The philosophy Han Fei developed was brutally logical. Humans, he argued, were fundamentally selfish creatures who responded only to incentives. A wise ruler would therefore create a system of laws so clear and punishments so severe that self-interest would align perfectly with state interest. There was no need to hope for virtuous officials when you could create conditions where even corrupt officials would serve the state effectively. The key was to make compliance more profitable than rebellion, and punishment more terrible than any possible reward for disobedience. But Han Fei went further than previous legalist thinkers, like SHANG. He developed sophisticated theories about political power, arguing that a successful ruler must remain mysterious and unpredictable, while maintaining absolute control over information and decision-making. The ideal monarch would be like a spider at the center of a web, feeling every vibration but remaining invisible to those caught in his trap. Officials would compete for favor without ever being certain of their standing, keeping them focused on performance rather than palace intrigue. These ideas might have remained academic exercises, if not for the rise of the state of Qin. Han Fei's own kingdom was too weak and corrupt to implement his reforms, but Qin had already demonstrated the effectiveness of legalist principles under Shang. When copies of Han Fei's writings reached the Qin court, they created a sensation. Here was someone who had taken the practical lessons of Qin's success and transformed them into a comprehensive theory of government. The young king of Qin, who would later become China's first emperor, was particularly impressed. This was a ruler who understood power instinctively, but lacked the intellectual framework to justify his methods. Han Fei's writings provided exactly that framework, offering philosophical validation for the harsh policies that practical necessity had already dictated. The king reportedly said that if he could meet the author of these texts and work with him, he would die without regret. The opportunity came in 233 BCE, when diplomatic tensions between Han and Qin reached a crisis point. Han Fei was chosen to lead a mission to the Qin court, partly because of his reputation as a brilliant theorist, and partly because his physical limitations made him seem less threatening than other potential ambassadors. It was a decision that would prove fatal, though not in the way anyone expected. At the Qin court, Han Fei found himself in a position that would have been ironic if it weren't so dangerous. Here was the kingdom that had most successfully implemented his ideas, ruled by a man who genuinely admired his work. But the very success of legalist principles in Qin meant that Han Fei's presence there was viewed through the lens of realpolitik rather than intellectual appreciation. The problem was Li Si, Han Fei's former classmate and now Qin's chief minister. Both men had studied under the same master, the Confucian philosopher Xunzi, but had drawn very different conclusions from their education. Li Si had risen to power by demonstrating absolute loyalty to his adopted state, while Han Fei remained emotionally tied to his homeland, despite his criticism of its policies. In the zero-sum world of warring states diplomacy, this made Han Fei inherently suspect. Li Si understood better than anyone the implications of Han Fei's presence in Qin. Here was a man whose intellectual brilliance was matched only by his loyalty to a rival state. If Han Fei succeeded in his diplomatic mission, he might strengthen Han enough to resist Qin's expansion. If he remained in Qin, he could become a rival for the king's attention and potentially challenge Li Si's position. From a purely legalist perspective, Han Fei represented a threat that needed to be eliminated regardless of his personal intentions. The solution Li Si devised was worthy of the political philosophy both men had studied. Rather than openly opposing Han Fei, he began a subtle campaign of insinuation and doubt. He pointed out to the king that Han Fei's loyalties would always be divided. How could someone who truly understood statecraft serve two masters? He suggested that Han Fei's mission was itself evidence of Han's weakness, and that keeping him in Qin would be seen as an act of aggression that might complicate relations with other states. The brilliance of Li Si's approach was that he used Han Fei's own theories against him. According to legalist principles, personal relationships and intellectual admiration were irrelevant to statecraft. What mattered was whether Han Fei's continued existence served Qin's interests. And Li Si was able to argue convincingly that it did not. The very philosophy that had brought Han Fei to the king's attention now became the justification for his destruction. The final act unfolded with the mechanical precision that legalist theory demanded. Li Si arranged for evidence to be fabricated, suggesting that Han Fei was planning to escape back to Han with sensitive information about Qin's military preparations. The evidence was almost certainly forged, but it didn't need to be convincing, it just needed to provide legal justification for what political necessity had already dictated. Han Fei was arrested and imprisoned while his case was investigated. He knew exactly what was happening and why his own writings had provided the theoretical framework for his destruction. In a desperate attempt to save himself, he wrote a final letter to the king, defending his loyalty and explaining the philosophical principles that should govern the ruler's decision. It was a masterpiece of political analysis, but it was also completely irrelevant to the outcome. Li Si, understanding that Han Fei's intellectual gifts made him dangerous even in prison, arranged for poison to be delivered to the cell. The official story would be suicide remorse over his treasonous activities had driven the prisoner to take his own life. Han Fei, faced with the choice between a painful public execution and a quiet death in private, chose the poison. His last act was to complete the letter he had been writing, knowing it would never reach its intended recipient. The irony of Han Fei's death was lost on no one at the Qin court. Here was the greatest theorist of legalist government, destroyed by the perfect application of his own principles. Li Si had acted exactly as Han Fei's writings suggested a rational minister should act, eliminating a potential threat to state security, regardless of personal relationships or intellectual admiration. The system was working precisely as designed, but perhaps the greatest irony was yet to come. The writings Han Fei had smuggled out of prison during his final days would become the foundation text for Chinese imperial government. The very ideas that had led to his death would guide Chinese rulers for the next 2 millennia, making him arguably the most influential political philosopher in human history. He had been silenced, but his voice would speak through the institutions he had designed long after his enemies were forgotten. The emperor who had admired Han Fei's work went on to conquer all of China, using principles that Han Fei had articulated better than anyone else. The unified Chinese empire was built on legalist foundations, governed by the kind of systematic approach to power that Han Fei had described in his writings. In death, he achieved an influence that he never could have attained in life. The fate of Han Fei became a cautionary tale about the relationship between ideas and power. His writings had provided the intellectual framework for creating the most efficient government the world had yet seen, but that same efficiency made it impossible for him to survive once he was perceived as a threat. He had helped create a machine that worked perfectly, and it worked perfectly even when it was killing him. In the end, Han Fei's death illustrated one of the central paradoxes of political philosophy. The very ideas that make government more effective also make it more dangerous to those who created them. He had argued that rational statecraft required the subordination of personal relationships to state interests, and Li Si had simply followed that logic to its inevitable conclusion. The voice of legalism had been muzzled by legalism itself, in what may be the most perfect example of philosophical suicide in human history. Zeno of ELEA, tortured for a plot against tyranny. In the great pantheon of martyred philosophers, Zeno of ELEA occupies a unique position. He was tortured and executed, not for his ideas about reality or knowledge, but for the very practical crime of political conspiracy. Yet, even in death, this master of paradox managed to create one final puzzle that scholars are still trying to solve more than 2 millennia later. The Greek colonies of southern Italy in the 5th century BCE were a strange mixture of intellectual sophistication and political brutality. Cities like ELEA had produced some of the most original thinkers in human history, but they remained small, vulnerable communities, surrounded by hostile neighbors and governed by men who understood that power, once lost, was rarely regained peacefully. It was a world where philosophical schools could flourish in the morning and be crushed by political violence in the afternoon. Zeno had been born into this precarious world around 490 BCE, inheriting not just the intellectual tradition of his master Parmenides, but also the dangerous honor of being a prominent citizen in a city where prominence itself could be fatal. His philosophical work on paradoxes and infinite regression had already established him as one of the most acute thinkers of his generation, but like many intellectuals in small Greek cities, he couldn't afford to remain aloof from political affairs. The tyrant who ruled the ancient sources disagree on whether his name was Nearchus or Perilos, represented everything that thoughtful Greeks had come to fear about unchecked power. He had likely come to power through a combination of popular support and violence, promising stability and prosperity while systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge his authority. Like tyrants throughout the Greek world, he understood that intellectual independence and political autocracy were fundamentally incompatible. The exact nature of the conspiracy against this tyrant remains mysterious. Ancient historians tell us that Zeno was involved in a plot to overthrow the government, but they provide frustratingly few details about its scope or methodology. What seems clear is that this was not a spontaneous uprising, but a carefully planned operation that required extensive coordination among the conspirators. Zeno's role appears to have been crucial, whether as an intellectual architect of the plot or simply as a prominent citizen whose participation would lend legitimacy to the enterprise. The conspiracy failed, as most such plots did in the Greek world. Tyrannicides might become heroes in later generations, but in their own time, they were usually just dead idealists whose noble intentions proved no match for the tyrant's intelligence network and capacity for violence. The sources suggest that Zeno was captured while carrying secret messages between different groups of conspirators, a prosaic end for someone who had spent his career contemplating the deepest mysteries of existence. What happened next created one of the most famous legends in ancient literature, though modern scholars debate whether it should be taken literally or understood as symbolic storytelling. According to multiple ancient sources, Zeno was subjected to torture in an attempt to make him reveal the names of his fellow conspirators. The torturers used the standard methods of the time beatings, the rack, burning, but Zeno refused to provide the information they sought. The climax of the story involves an act of defiance so extraordinary that it entered into philosophical folklore. According to the legend, Zeno somehow managed to bite off his own tongue and spit it at the tyrant, either to prevent himself from revealing secrets under further torture, or simply as a final gesture of contempt. The image is so powerful that it appeared in countless retellings over the centuries, becoming a symbol of intellectual courage in the face of political oppression. But here's where Zeno's final paradox reveals itself. The more closely scholars examine this story, the less certain they become about what actually happened. Some ancient sources say he bit off his tongue entirely, others that he only bit part of it. Some place the incident during torture, others suggest it happened during a public interrogation. A few versions even claim that he used the distraction to attack the tyrant directly, though this seems less plausible given that he was presumably restrained. The uncertainty isn't just about details, it extends to the fundamental question of whether any of this actually occurred. The story has all the hallmarks of a moral tale designed to illustrate philosophical principles, rather than a historical account meant to record facts. In a culture that valued cleverness and defiance of authority, what better way to honor a martyred philosopher than to credit him with the ultimate act of resistance? Yet the legend's persistence suggests something important about how ancient Greeks understood the relationship between philosophical inquiry and political courage. Zeno had spent his career demonstrating that reality was far more complex than it appeared, that simple assumptions about motion, space, and time led to impossible contradictions. His famous paradoxes Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow in flight, showed that even the most obvious truths could be questioned if one thought carefully enough. The tongue-biting story, whether literally true or not, serves as a perfect metaphor for this same intellectual courage applied to politics. Just as Zeno had refused to accept conventional wisdom about the nature of reality, he apparently refused to accept conventional wisdom about the inevitability of tyrannical power. The same mind that could conceive of infinite regression in mathematical problems could also conceive of infinite resistance to political oppression. The execution itself was probably swift and brutal, following the standard practices for dealing with political conspirators in the Greek world. Tyrants understood that prolonged public executions could create martyrs, while quick, efficient killings simply eliminated problems. The details don't matter as much as the fact that another voice of independent thought had been silenced by someone who couldn't tolerate the questions it might ask. But in Zeno's case, the silencing was particularly ironic. His philosophical work had been all about demonstrating the power of paradox, showing how logical reasoning could lead to conclusions that seemed to contradict common sense. His death created the ultimate paradox. A man who had devoted his life to showing that reality was more complex than it appeared, killed for the simple political crime of opposing tyranny. The broader implications of Zeno's execution extended far beyond ELEA. His death came during a period when Greek intellectuals were beginning to understand that their pursuit of knowledge couldn't be separated from the political conditions that made such pursuits possible. You couldn't investigate the nature of reality while ignoring the nature of power, because those who held power would inevitably have opinions about which investigations were acceptable. This realization would shape Greek philosophy for generations. Later thinkers like Plato would spend considerable energy trying to solve the problem Zeno's death had illustrated: how to create political systems that could protect intellectual freedom while maintaining social order. The tension between philosophical inquiry and political stability that cost Zeno his life would become one of the central preoccupations of Western thought. The legend of Zeno's final defiance also established a template for how philosophers should behave under political pressure. Whether or not he actually bit off his tongue, the story suggested that intellectual integrity required a willingness to suffer rather than compromise. This became a powerful model for later thinkers who found themselves in similar situations. Perhaps most importantly, Zeno's death demonstrated that even the most abstract philosophical ideas could have dangerous political implications. His paradoxes might have seemed like harmless intellectual exercises, but they were part of a broader tradition of questioning authority and challenging conventional wisdom. In the hands of someone willing to apply the same critical thinking to politics, such methods could indeed be subversive. The execution of Zeno thus represents a turning point in the history of Western thought, the moment when it became clear that philosophy and politics were inseparably linked, that the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of power would always be in tension. His death reminded future generations that some ideas were worth dying for, and that the price of intellectual freedom might sometimes be paid in blood. In the end, Zeno's final paradox was the most profound of all, that a man could be silenced for asking questions, yet his questions could outlive the silence. The tyrant who killed him is remembered only as a footnote to the philosopher's story, while Zeno's paradoxes continue to challenge and illuminate minds more than 2,000 years after his death. Cicero, the orator's last argument. December in Rome, 43 BCE. The republic that had conquered the Mediterranean was devouring itself with the methodical efficiency it had once applied to foreign enemies. The prescription lists those death warrants masquerading as legal documents were being posted throughout the city, and citizens who had awakened as respected members of society found themselves marked for execution before the sun had set. It was the kind of political chaos that transforms civilization into organized murder, and Marcus Tullius Cicero had the misfortune of being both too important to ignore and too principled to compromise. The man fleeing through the Italian countryside that winter was no longer the confident orator who had once saved Rome from Catiline's conspiracy, or the philosophical writer who had introduced Greek wisdom to Roman audiences. At 63, Cicero was exhausted by decades of political struggle, worn down by the constant necessity of choosing between competing loyalties in a world where every choice carried mortal consequences. The republic he had spent his life defending was already dead. He was just too stubborn to acknowledge its funeral. The immediate cause of his downfall was a series of speeches that would become known as the Philippics, named after Demosthenes' orations against Philip of Macedon. These 14 speeches, delivered between 44 and 43 BCE, represented Cicero's final attempt to rally the Roman Senate against the rising power of Mark Antony. They were masterpieces of invective, combining legal argument with personal attack in a way that devastated Antony's reputation while exposing the speaker to mortal danger. What made the Philippics so dangerous wasn't just their content, but their effectiveness. Cicero had spent 40 years perfecting the art of persuasion, learning how to move audiences through carefully crafted appeals to emotion, reason, and shared values. When he turned these skills against Antony, the result was political theater of the highest order speeches that could make grown senators weep with patriotic fervor or laugh at their target's supposed sexual peculiarities. Antony understood exactly what Cicero's oratory represented: the power of words to shape reality, the ability of a skilled speaker to transform public opinion and thereby change the course of history. In a world increasingly dominated by military force, Cicero represented the lingering possibility that argument might still triumph over violence, that the old republican traditions of debate and persuasion might still have relevance. But 43 BCE was not a year for such optimism. The second triumvirate, the alliance between Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus, had been formed with the explicit purpose of consolidating power through any means necessary. Unlike the informal first triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this was a legal arrangement that gave the three men dictatorial authority to restore order to the republic. Their first act was to draw up prescription lists of political enemies who would be killed and their property confiscated. The negotiations over these lists revealed the cold calculation that now governed Roman politics. Each triumvir was required to sacrifice some of his own supporters to satisfy his partner's desire for revenge. Octavian, despite his later claims of reluctance, agreed to Cicero's inclusion on the list in exchange for Antony's consent to other names. The greatest orator in Roman history was traded away like a piece of merchandise in a political marketplace. When news of the prescriptions reached Cicero, he was at his villa in Tusculum, still hoping that some accommodation might be possible with the new regime. His first instinct was to flee to Greece, where he might join Brutus and Cassius in their ongoing resistance to the triumvirs. But escape required quick decision-making and ruthless pragmatism qualities that had never been Cicero's strongest suits. The journey toward the coast became a painful illustration of how quickly political prominence could transform into mortal vulnerability. Roads that Cicero had traveled countless times as a respected magistrate and honored ex-consul now seemed filled with potential informants and bounty hunters. Slaves who had once competed for the privilege of serving him now had to calculate whether loyalty was worth the risk of sharing his fate. At Astura, his villa on the coast, Cicero briefly attempted to board a ship for Macedonia, but seasickness and despair overwhelmed him. According to his biographer, Plutarch, he was haunted by dreams of his own death and paralyzed by indecision about whether resistance or submission offered better hope of survival. He returned to shore and made his way to his villa at Formiae, perhaps hoping that his enemies would be satisfied with exile rather than death. It was there, on December 7th, that the assassins found him. The centurion Herennius and the military tribune Popilius Laenas, both men whose careers had benefited from Cicero's earlier patronage, tracked him down with the efficiency that Roman military training instilled. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Cicero was being killed by representatives of the same professional army class that his speeches had often praised as the backbone of Roman virtue. The final moments of Cicero's life created one of the most powerful images in the literature of political martyrdom. According to the accounts that have survived, he made no attempt to flee when the soldiers surrounded his litter. Instead, he calmly emerged and, in a gesture that became legendary, offered his neck to the executioner's sword. His last recorded words were a simple acceptance of his fate. "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly." The beheading was swift, but Antony's revenge was not yet complete. Following his explicit instructions, the soldiers also severed Cicero's hands, the same hands that had written the Philippics and countless other speeches that had shaped Roman political discourse for decades. The head and hands were carried back to Rome and displayed on the speaker's platform in the Forum, where Cicero had delivered so many of his greatest orations. The symbolism was deliberately brutal. By displaying Cicero's severed head and hands in the very place where he had once swayed audiences with his eloquence, Antony was sending a clear message about the new realities of Roman politics. The age of persuasion was over. The age of force had begun. Words, no matter how skillfully crafted, were powerless against swords. But even in death, Cicero managed to achieve a kind of victory over his executioners. Antony's wife Fulvia, according to several ancient sources, pierced the dead orator's tongue with golden hair pincer gesture that was intended as the ultimate humiliation, but instead became a symbol of the regime's fear of Cicero's continuing influence. They could kill the man, but they couldn't kill the ideas he had articulated or the example he had set. The broader significance of Cicero's execution extended far beyond personal revenge or political expedience. His death marked the end of the Roman Republic, not just as a political system, but as a cultural ideal. For centuries, Romans had believed that their civilization was built on the rule of law, the power of oratory, and the possibility that citizens could shape their common destiny through reasoned debate. Cicero had embodied these ideals more completely than any other figure of his generation. He had risen from provincial obscurity to the consulship through nothing but talent and hard work. He had saved the Republic from Catiline's conspiracy through investigation and persuasion, rather than violence. He had introduced Roman audiences to the greatest works of Greek philosophy, making intellectual sophistication a mark of Roman citizenship. His death, therefore, represented more than the elimination of a political opponent. It was the murder of the Republic's own highest aspirations. The Rome that emerged from the civil wars would be more powerful and more stable than the Republic had ever been, but it would also be fundamentally different in character. The emperor who ruled this new Rome would have no need for Cicero's skills, because he would have no need to persuade anyone of anything. The long-term influence of Cicero's death can be traced through centuries of subsequent political thought. His example became a touchstone for anyone trying to understand the relationship between intellectual freedom and political power. Renaissance humanists saw in his fate a warning about the dangers of mixing scholarship with politics. Enlightenment thinkers found in his speeches a model for how eloquence could serve liberty. Perhaps most importantly, Cicero's execution established a template for how democratic societies should remember their martyred voices. His death reminded later generations that the freedoms they enjoyed, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to criticize those in power, had been purchased with blood. The price of preserving these freedoms was eternal vigilance against those who would sacrifice principle for power. In the end, Cicero's last argument wasn't delivered in the Senate or the courts, but through the manner of his death. By refusing to flee, by offering his neck to the executioner, by maintaining his dignity even in defeat, he demonstrated that some things were indeed worth dying for. The republic he had loved was gone, but the ideals it had represented at its best would survive to inspire future generations. The orator's voice had been silenced, but his final speech delivered through his courage in the face of death would echo through the centuries, reminding all who heard it that the price of freedom is always the willingness of some to pay the ultimate cost for its preservation. Seneca, the younger Stoic farewell. The year 65 CE found the Roman Empire at the height of its power and the depths of its moral confusion. Nero had been emperor for 11 years, and what had begun as a promising reign, guided by philosophical advisors, had degenerated into a paranoid autocracy where survival depended more on the emperor's whims than on any recognizable system of justice. In this atmosphere of fear and unpredictability, being close to power had become almost as dangerous as opposing it. Lucius Annaeus Seneca understood this paradox better than most. For over a decade, he had served as Nero's tutor, advisor, and when the emperor would listen, moral compass. He had tried to channel the unlimited power of imperial rule towards something resembling virtue, using his position to moderate Nero's worst impulses while advancing Stoic principles of duty, rationality, and service to the common good. It was an impossible task that had made him enormously wealthy, while slowly destroying his soul. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE was named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator who had grown tired of Nero's theatrical excesses and increasingly erratic behavior. The plot was elaborate in its scope and amateurish in its execution. Dozens of conspirators from the highest ranks of Roman society, united by little more than shared disgust for their emperor and vague hopes that someone else might govern more responsibly. It was exactly the kind of aristocratic conspiracy that Roman political culture produced regularly and that rarely succeeded in achieving anything beyond the deaths of its participants. Seneca's connection to the conspiracy was tenuous at best. He had grown increasingly isolated from court politics as Nero's behavior became more unpredictable, and there's no credible evidence that he actively participated in planning the emperor's assassination. But in the paranoid atmosphere following the plot's discovery, actual guilt was less important than the appearance of disloyalty. Seneca had become a liability too prominent to ignore, too independent to trust, too wealthy to let live. The philosopher learned of his fate through a message from Nero that was characteristic of the emperor's peculiar mixture of courtesy and cruelty. Rather than simply ordering Seneca's arrest and execution, Nero sent word that his former tutor should choose his own method of death. It was presented as a mark of respect for their long relationship, but everyone understood it for what it really was: a command disguised as a favor, tyranny dressed up as consideration. Seneca's response revealed everything about the man and the philosophy that had guided his life. Rather than raging against the injustice of his situation or attempting to flee, he gathered his household around him and began to orchestrate his own death with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his writing and teaching. This would be his final lesson in Stoic philosophia, demonstration that a wise man could maintain control over his destiny, even when facing the ultimate loss of control. The decision to include his wife Paulina in his suicide was controversial even among his contemporaries. She insisted on dying with him, either from genuine devotion or from the understanding that her own survival would be precarious once Seneca was gone. The image of an elderly couple calmly discussing the best method for ending their lives together captures something essential about the Stoic approach to mortality. Death was simply another natural process that could be faced with dignity if one maintained the proper philosophical perspective. The method they chose was traditional for Roman aristocrats, opening the veins in their arms and allowing themselves to bleed to death. It was considered a noble way to die, slower than poison, but more certain than hanging, and it allowed time for final conversations and last philosophical reflections. Seneca began the process by making small cuts in his arms and legs, settling back to wait for unconsciousness to overtake him. But the bleeding proceeded more slowly than expected. Seneca's advanced age and abstemious lifestyle had left him with poor circulation, and the blood flowed too sluggishly to bring quick relief. What should have been a dignified philosophical death began to transform into something closer to torture hours of gradual weakening while maintaining consciousness and the need to comfort his increasingly distressed household. The prolonged dying gave Seneca an opportunity for one final display of the rhetorical skills that had made him famous throughout the empire. Even as his strength ebbed, he continued to discourse on philosophical themes, offering comfort to his friends and servants, while demonstrating that a truly wise man could maintain equanimity under any circumstances. It was performance art of the highest order, a lived demonstration of Stoic principles at the moment of their ultimate test. When the bleeding proved insufficient, Seneca asked for hemlock, the same poison that had killed Socrates 5 centuries earlier. The parallel was surely intentional, reminder that philosophy had always required the courage to die for one's principles. But even the hemlock worked slowly in his weakened system, and additional measures became necessary to complete what had begun as a philosophical statement and devolved into a medical emergency. The final act took place in a warm bath, where the heat was supposed to accelerate his circulation and speed the process of dying. When that too proved inadequate, Seneca was carried to a steam room, where the hot, humid air would suffocate him more quickly than continued bleeding. The prolonged nature of his death had transformed what was meant to be a demonstration of philosophical mastery into something that looked disturbingly like the emperor's revenge. Throughout this ordeal, Seneca maintained the composure that his Stoic training had cultivated. Ancient sources report that he continued to dictate thoughts to his secretaries, even as his consciousness faded, ensuring that his final philosophical insights would survive his physical destruction. The image of a dying man, still concerned with literary legacy, captures something essential about the Roman aristocratic approach to mortality. Death was acceptable as long as it could be transformed into lasting reputation. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Seneca's death was Nero's intervention to save Paulina's life. The emperor, apparently concerned about the political implications of allowing a prominent woman to die alongside her husband, sent soldiers to bandage her wounds and prevent her suicide. She lived for several more years, a walking reminder of her husband's fate and the arbitrary nature of imperial mercy. The broader significance of Seneca's execution extended far beyond the immediate political circumstances that caused it. Here was a man who had spent decades trying to reconcile philosophical idealism with political reality, attempting to use his position as imperial advisor to advance Stoic principles of virtue and rational governance. His death marked the failure of that experiment and the final separation of philosophy from political power in the Roman Empire. Seneca's philosophical writings had always grappled with the tension between Stoic theory and Roman practice. How could one maintain inner tranquility while serving in a government that routinely employed violence and deception? How could one pursue virtue while accumulating the wealth and status that Roman society demanded? His letters and essays explored these dilemmas with unprecedented psychological sophistication, but they had never fully resolved the contradictions. His death provided a kind of answer, though not the one he might have preferred. The Stoic ideal of maintaining virtue regardless of external circumstances proved achievable even under the extreme pressure of forced suicide. Seneca had demonstrated that philosophical principles could indeed guide behavior in the face of ultimate adversity, but only by completely abandoning any hope of reforming the political system from within. The manner of his dying also established a template for how later intellectuals would face political persecution. The emphasis on maintaining dignity, the concern with literary legacy, the attempt to transform personal destruction into philosophical demonstration all became standard elements in the cultural script for martyred thinkers. Seneca had shown that even in defeat, a philosopher could achieve a kind of victory by controlling the narrative of his own destruction. The irony of Seneca's fate wasn't lost on contemporary observers. Here was a man who had written extensively about the corrupting influence of wealth and power, yet had accumulated both in unprecedented quantities during his years as imperial advisor. He had preached the Stoic virtue of indifference to external goods, while living in luxury that would have embarrassed earlier generations of Roman aristocrats. Yet his death redeemed these contradictions by proving that his philosophical convictions ran deeper than his material circumstances. When forced to choose between life and principle, he chose principle without hesitation. The wealth and status that had seemed to compromise his Stoic credentials became irrelevant in the face of his willingness to sacrifice everything for philosophical consistency. The long-term influence of Seneca's death can be traced through centuries of Western literature and philosophy. His combination of Stoic theory with Roman practicality created a model of philosophical engagement that appealed to later thinkers who faced similar dilemmas about the relationship between thought and action. Renaissance humanists, Enlightenment philosophies, and modern intellectuals have all found inspiration in his example. Perhaps most importantly, Seneca's execution illustrated the fundamental tension between philosophical independence and political involvement that would haunt Western intellectual life for centuries to come. His fate demonstrated that proximity to power inevitably compromises philosophical integrity, but also that complete withdrawal from political engagement abandons any hope of using wisdom to improve human conditions. In the end, Seneca achieved in death what had eluded him in life: perfect consistency between his philosophical principles and his actions. The man who had written that every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end had discovered in his own ending a new beginning for Stoic philosophy. Freed from the compromises that political involvement had required, his farewell became philosophy's reminder that some truths can only be demonstrated through the ultimate sacrifice. BOETHIUS, Consolation, in a Cell. The year was 524 CE, and the world that had once been the Roman Empire was learning to live with new realities. In Italy, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric ruled from Ravenna with a mixture of Germanic pragmatism and Roman administrative sophistication, trying to maintain the delicate balance between his Gothic warriors and his Roman subjects. It was a precarious arrangement that worked only as long as everyone agreed to pretend that ancient loyalties and ethnic divisions didn't matter as much as practical governance. Anicius Manlius Severinus Boethius had been born into this uncertain world, inheriting both the intellectual tradition of late Roman philosophy and the political responsibilities that came with aristocratic birth. By 524, he was perhaps the most learned man in Italia, master of Greek philosophy, in an age when such knowledge was becoming rare, a skilled administrator who had risen to the highest levels of Theodoric's government, and a devoted father who had seen his own sons follow him into public service. But intellectual brilliance and political acumen offered no protection against the paranoia that gripped aging rulers. Theodoric, once confident in his ability to balance Roman and Gothic interests, had grown increasingly suspicious of his Roman subjects' loyalty. The emergence of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian had created new pressures suddenly. Educated Romans had an alternative focus for their allegiance, and every diplomatic contact with Constantinople could be interpreted as potential treason. The specific charges against Boethius were typical of the political prosecutions that marked the final years of Theodoric's reign. He was accused of treasonous correspondence with Byzantine officials, of participating in a conspiracy to restore Roman rule in Italy, and of using his position in the government to undermine Gothic authority. The evidence was probably fabricated, the accusations almost certainly false, but in the toxic atmosphere of 524, truth mattered less than the appearance of disloyalty. What transformed this routine political persecution into one of history's most significant philosophical events was Boethius's response to his imprisonment. Rather than spending his final months in despair or futile attempts at legal defense, he devoted himself to writing what would become one of the most influential books in Western literature, The Consolation of Philosophy. It was a work that transformed personal suffering into universal wisdom, individual tragedy into lasting literary achievement. The Consolation takes the form of a dialogue between Boethius and philosophy, personified as a majestic woman who appears in his cell to offer comfort and instruction. The conversation that unfolds covers all the great themes of human existence: the nature of happiness, the problem of evil, the relationship between divine providence and human free will, the proper response to fortune's reversals. It was philosophy as therapeutic practice. Wisdom applied to the specific problem of how to die well. What makes the work so remarkable is how it manages to be both deeply personal and universally applicable. Boethius writes about his own situation, the loss of status, the separation from family, the approach of death, but he treats these specifics as instances of general truths about the human condition. Everyone faces loss. Everyone must confront mortality. Everyone must decide what really matters when everything else is stripped away. The philosophical argument that emerges from this dialogue is sophisticated and surprisingly optimistic. Lady Philosophy teaches Boethius that true happiness cannot depend on external goods, wealth, status, power, even life itself, because all such goods are subject to fortune's whims. Real consolation comes from understanding that the only goods that matter are internal: wisdom, virtue, the rational soul's participation in divine truth. These goods cannot be taken away by any earthly authority. But the consolation is also notable for what it doesn't contain. This was a man who had been deeply involved in the theological controversies of his time, who had written extensively on Christian doctrine and the relationship between faith and reason. Yet the work he produced in his final months relies almost entirely on classical philosophical arguments, drawing more heavily on Plato and Aristotle than on Christian scripture or church fathers. This choice has puzzled scholars for centuries. Was Boethius demonstrating that philosophical reason alone could provide adequate consolation for human suffering? Was he trying to create a work that would appeal to both Christian and pagan readers? Or had the extremity of his situation forced him back to the most fundamental questions about existence, the ones that transcended any particular religious tradition? The writing process itself took place under conditions that make its achievement even more remarkable. Boethius was imprisoned in a cell in Pavia, cut off from his library, denied access to the books that had been the foundation of his intellectual life. The Consolation was composed entirely from memory, drawing on decades of reading and reflection that had prepared him, unknowingly, for this final test of his philosophical commitments. The political situation outside his cell continued to deteriorate as he wrote. Theodoric's paranoia had expanded beyond individual cases to encompass entire segments of the Roman aristocracy. Boethius's father-in-law, Symmachus, one of the most respected senators of his generation, was arrested and executed on similar charges. The old Roman families that had cooperated with Gothic rule for 30 years were being systematically eliminated, their wealth confiscated, their loyalty repaid with suspicion and violence. Yet none of this political chaos appears directly in the Consolation. Boethius creates a literary space that is almost completely isolated from immediate historical circumstances, focusing instead on eternal questions that would remain relevant regardless of who happened to be ruling Italy. It was philosophy as an act of resistance, not political resistance to Theodoric's rule, but spiritual resistance to the claim that immediate circumstances should determine our ultimate values. The execution, when it finally came, was brutal, even by the standards of the time. According to contemporary accounts, Boethius was tortured before being killed, possibly in an attempt to extract confessions that would implicate other members of the Roman aristocracy. The method of execution, apparently involving either strangulation or bludgeoning, was designed to maximize suffering rather than simply end life efficiently. But the manner of his death mattered less than the literary legacy he had created during his imprisonment. The Consolation of Philosophy would become one of the most widely read books in medieval Europe, translated into virtually every vernacular language and cited by authors from Dante to Chaucer to countless anonymous scribes who found in it exactly what its title promised: genuine consolation for the inevitable sufferings of human existence. The work's influence extended far beyond literature into the realm of practical philosophy. Medieval readers found in Boethius a model for how educated Christians could engage with classical learning without compromising their faith. Renaissance humanists discovered a kindred spirit who had used ancient wisdom to address contemporary problems. Modern readers have continued to find relevance in his exploration of how philosophical reflection can provide stability in times of political and personal chaos. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Consolation is how it manages to be both stoically accepting and passionately engaged with the world. Boethius doesn't advocate withdrawal from political life or indifference to human suffering. Instead, he argues for a kind of engaged, detachment-full participation in worldly affairs, combined with the understanding that one's ultimate happiness cannot depend on worldly success. This balance between engagement and detachment reflected Boethius's own life experience. He had been deeply involved in the governance of Ostrogothic Italy, had used his position to advance learning and justice, had taken real risks to protect others from persecution. His final philosophical work doesn't repudiate this engagement, but rather places it in a larger context that makes both success and failure bearable. The execution of Boethius marked the end of the classical tradition in Western Europe in a more definitive way than even the fall of Rome itself. Here was the last man who possessed comprehensive knowledge of Greek philosophy, who could read Plato and Aristotle in the original, who maintained the intellectual continuity that connected late antiquity with its classical roots. His death represented not just the elimination of an individual but the severing of a cultural transmission that had lasted for nearly a millennium. Yet paradoxically, his death also ensured the survival of that tradition in transformed form. The Consolation of Philosophy became a bridge between the ancient world and medieval Christianity, preserving essential insights from classical philosophy within a framework that medieval readers could accept and understand. Boethius had accomplished something that no deliberate cultural program could have achieved. He had distilled the wisdom of antiquity into a form that could survive the collapse of the civilization that had created it. In the end, the consolation that Boethius found in philosophy proved to be genuine. His execution eliminated a brilliant individual, but couldn't destroy the ideas he had articulated or the example he had set. The cell in Pavia, where he wrote his final work, became a symbol of philosophy's power to transcend immediate circumstances, to find meaning and purpose even in the face of ultimate defeat. The man who had sought to console himself in the face of death had created a work that would console countless others facing their own encounters with loss, injustice, and mortality. His final philosophical achievement had transformed personal tragedy into lasting wisdom, proving that sometimes the greatest victories are won not despite defeat, but through the manner in which defeat is embraced. Justin Martyr, an apologist beheaded. Rome in the middle of the 2nd century CE was a city of competing certainties. In the philosophical schools scattered throughout the metropolis, teachers and students debated the nature of reality with the confidence that reasoned argument could resolve any question. In the temples and shrines that dotted every neighborhood, priests performed rituals that had supposedly maintained divine favor for centuries. And in the growing Christian communities that met in homes and workshops, believers proclaimed that God had revealed himself definitively through a Jewish carpenter who had been crucified under Pontius Pilate. Justin of Flavia Neapolis, the man who would become known to history as Justin Martyrad, sampled all these certainties before finding the one that seemed most compelling. Born around 100 CE in what is now Nablus, he had received the classical education that was the birthright of prosperous provincials, studying rhetoric, literature, and philosophy, with the expectation that such learning would prepare him for a career in imperial administration or provincial governance. But Justin had been drawn more to questions than to careers. His autobiography, embedded in his Dialogue with Trypho, describes a spiritual and intellectual journey that took him through most of the major philosophical schools of his time. He had studied with Stoics, who taught that happiness came from aligning oneself with the rational order of the universe. He had learned from Peripatetics, who emphasized the importance of empirical observation and logical analysis. He had even dabbled in Pythagoreanism, with its mystical emphasis on mathematical harmony and spiritual purification. None of these systems had fully satisfied him. Each offered partial insights into the nature of reality, but none seemed to address what Justin considered the fundamental question. How could finite human beings achieve knowledge of infinite truth? The philosophers could describe the natural world with impressive precision, but when it came to the ultimate questions, the nature of God, the destiny of the soul, the meaning of existence, they offered only speculation and hypothesis. The encounter that changed everything took place, according to Justin's own account, during a solitary walk along the seashore. An elderly Christian engaged him in conversation about philosophy and gradually led him to see that the Hebrew prophets had possessed insights into divine truth that surpassed anything achieved by Greek thinkers. This wasn't anti-intellectual obscurantism. Justin remained convinced that reason was essential for understanding reality, but rather the recognition that reason alone might be insufficient for apprehending ultimate truth. Justin's conversion to Christianity around 130 CE didn't end his philosophical career, but rather redirected it. He became what later generations would call an apologist, someone who used philosophical arguments to defend Christian beliefs against pagan criticism, and to demonstrate that faith and reason were not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing. His major works, the First Apology and Second Apology, were addressed to emperors and other educated pagans, attempting to show that Christianity was not the dangerous superstition its critics claimed, but rather the fulfillment of humanity's highest intellectual and spiritual aspirations. The argument Justin developed was both sophisticated and dangerous. He contended that Greek philosophy, while valuable, was merely preparatory to the fuller revelation that God had provided through Christ. Plato's glimpse of eternal truth, Aristotle's logical methods, the Stoics' ethical insights all were partial anticipations of the complete wisdom that Christianity offered. This meant that educated pagans shouldn't see conversion as an abandonment of their intellectual heritage, but rather as its culmination. This approach put Justin in a uniquely vulnerable position. Traditional pagans saw him as a traitor to the cultural heritage that had made Rome great. Many Christians viewed his philosophical interests with suspicion, wondering whether his commitment to reasoned argument might compromise the purity of faith. Imperial authorities found his activities particularly troubling because he was demonstrating that Christianity could attract intelligent, educated converts rather than just the slaves and social outcasts who formed its earliest constituencies. The Rome where Justin taught was experiencing what historians call the Golden Age of the Antonine dynasty. Under emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius, the empire enjoyed unprecedented prosperity, cultural sophistication, and administrative efficiency. But this Golden Age had a dark side for religious minorities. The very success of traditional Roman culture made deviations from it seem more threatening, and the empire's prosperity made its leaders less tolerant of anything that might disrupt social harmony. The philosophical schools where Justin taught were located primarily along the Via Sacra, the sacred way that led through the heart of the Forum Romanum. This was the ceremonial center of the Roman world, where religious processions honored the gods who had supposedly granted Rome dominion over the Mediterranean, where triumphal parades celebrated military victories that extended that dominion to new territories. For Justin to teach Christian philosophy in such a location was itself a form of implicit criticism of the imperial system. The crisis that led to his arrest probably developed gradually rather than suddenly. Justin's debates with pagan philosophers were becoming increasingly public and increasingly contentious. His students were growing more numerous and more vocal in their defense of Christian beliefs. Most dangerously, some of his converts came from prominent Roman families, suggesting that Christianity was beginning to penetrate the social classes that the imperial system depended on for support. The immediate cause of the trial was almost certainly a denunciation by Crescens, a cynic philosopher who had engaged in public debates with Justin and found himself repeatedly out-argued. In the competitive world of Roman intellectual life, such defeats could be professionally damaging, and Crescens apparently decided that eliminating his opponent was easier than improving his own arguments. The charges he brought were the standard ones used against Christians: atheism, for refusing to worship the traditional gods, and sedition, for allegedly undermining social order. The trial took place before the urban prefect Rusticus, a man who was himself philosophically trained and who understood exactly what was at stake in Justin's case. This wasn't just another routine persecution of Christian troublemakers, but rather a test of whether the Roman intellectual establishment would tolerate the kind of systematic philosophical challenge that Justin represented. The surviving transcript of the trial reveals a fascinating encounter between two very different worldviews. Rusticus approached the proceedings with the calm professionalism of a Roman magistrate, expecting that reasonable discussion would lead to reasonable compromise. Justin responded with the passionate certainty of someone who had found ultimate truth and couldn't be persuaded to abandon it for the sake of political convenience. The prefect's questions were carefully crafted to give Justin opportunities to save himself. Would he acknowledge the traditional gods, even if he continued to maintain special devotion to Christ? Would he agree to limit his teaching to private circles rather than public debates? Would he consider some form of philosophical syncretism that could accommodate both Christian and pagan insights? Each question represented a potential escape route that would have allowed Justin to continue living and teaching while avoiding direct confrontation with imperial authority. Justin's responses were equally careful, but pointed in the opposite direction. He acknowledged his respect for philosophy, but insisted that Christian revelation provided truths that philosophy alone could never reach. He expressed loyalty to the emperor, but made clear that this loyalty had limits when it conflicted with loyalty to God. Most crucially, he refused to perform the simple ritual axe-burning incense to the emperor's image, pouring wine to traditional gods that would have demonstrated his acceptance of the religious foundation of Roman society. The dialogue that emerges from the trial transcript is remarkable for its civility. Both men were products of the same educational system. Both valued reasoned discourse. Both understood the philosophical issues at stake. Yet they inhabited fundamentally incompatible worldviews that made compromise impossible. Rusticus saw religious diversity as a luxury that successful societies could afford. Justin saw religious truth as the foundation that made any society worth preserving. When persuasion failed, Rusticus moved to threats. The penalty for refusing to sacrifice was death, and the prefect made clear that this wasn't an empty warning, but a legal requirement that he was prepared to enforce. Even at this point, Justin was given opportunities to reconsider. The Roman legal system preferred conversion to martyrdom, understanding that live converts were more useful than dead examples. But Justin had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. His philosophical journey had led him to the conclusion that truth was more valuable than life, that rational souls had obligations that transcended immediate circumstances, that the proper response to ultimate questions required ultimate commitment. His calm acceptance of the death sentence was the logical conclusion of the intellectual process that had brought him to Christianity in the first place. The execution was swift and professional. Roman law required that citizens condemned to death be beheaded rather than subjected to the more elaborate tortures reserved for slaves and foreigners. Justin's philosophical training had prepared him to face death with equanimity, and contemporary accounts suggest that he maintained his composure to the end, offering final prayers and words of encouragement to his fellow Christians who were executed alongside him. The broader significance of Justin's martyrdom extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of his case. His death established a template for how Christian intellectuals would engage with classical culture for centuries to come: respectful but critical, appreciative but ultimately independent. He had shown that conversion to Christianity didn't require abandoning philosophical sophistication, but rather redirecting it toward different ultimate commitments. Perhaps most importantly, Justin's execution demonstrated that intellectual disagreements could have mortal consequences in ways that transcended individual malice or political calculation. The Roman Empire had room for many different philosophical schools, many different approaches to ultimate questions, many different ways of organizing human life. But it couldn't tolerate systematic challenges to the religious assumptions that underlay its entire social order. The man who had sought to build bridges between Greek philosophy and Christian revelation had discovered that some bridges couldn't be built, that some gaps couldn't be crossed through reasoned argument alone. His death marked not the failure of his intellectual project, but rather its completions, the demonstration that philosophical conviction, when taken seriously, required the willingness to die for the truths one had discovered through rational investigation. In the end, Justin achieved in death what had eluded him in life: a perfect unity between his philosophical principles and his personal commitments. The apologist who had argued that faith and reason were mutually reinforcing had proven that claim through the ultimate test of both. Maximus of Ephesus, mystic at the crossroads. The year 372 CE marked the twilight of a world that had existed for over a millennium. The old gods of Greece and Rome, who had supposedly guided Alexander's conquests and legitimized Caesar's victories, were losing their final battle against the Christian God who promised not earthly glory, but eternal salvation. In this dying world of ancient mysteries and philosophical schools, Maximus of Ephesus represented everything that the new Christian order found both fascinating and dangerous. Maximus had been born into the golden age of late pagan philosophy, when the great schools of Athens and Alexandria still attracted students from across the Mediterranean world. The intellectual tradition he inherited was extraordinarily sophisticated, synthesis of Platonic metaphysics, Aristotelian logic, and mystical practices that claimed to offer direct contact with divine reality. This was philosophy as spiritual discipline, learning as a path to transcendence, reason as a means of ascending beyond the material world to commune with eternal truth. The particular brand of philosophy that Maximus practiced was called theurgy, literally God work, a system that combined rigorous intellectual training with elaborate ritual practices designed to purify the soul and enable mystical union with the divine. It was a demanding discipline that required years of study, strict moral preparation, and initiation into secret ceremonies that were said to reveal the hidden structure of reality itself. To Christian critics, theurgy looked like exactly the kind of demonic magic that the Bible warned against. To educated pagans, it represented the culmination of centuries of philosophical development, the final synthesis of Greek rationalism and Eastern mysticism that could provide what Christianity only promised: actual, verifiable contact with divine power. The tension between these worldviews would define the cultural conflicts of the 4th century. Maximus had established his reputation as the greatest theurgist of his generation through a dramatic demonstration of his powers. According to the historian Eunapius, he had caused a statue of the goddess Hecate to smile and laugh, her torches spontaneously bursting into flame, while a crowd of distinguished witnesses watched in amazement. Whether this was genuine supernatural intervention, sophisticated stagecraft, or simply legendary embellishment mattered less than what it represented: the claim that ancient philosophy still had access to sources of power that the new Christian religion couldn't match. This reputation brought Maximus to the attention of Julian, the young prince who had been raised Christian, but who secretly yearned for the intellectual sophistication and spiritual depth that he found in pagan philosophy. When Julian became emperor in 361 CE, one of his first acts was to summon Maximus to court and make him a principal advisor in what would become known as the last pagan revival in Roman history. The 3 years of Julian's reign were a strange interlude in the Christianization of the Roman Empire. The emperor attempted to restore the old gods through a combination of philosophical argument, legal reform, and personal example. He rebuilt temples, reinstituted ancient ceremonies, and tried to create a pagan clergy that could compete with Christian bishops for moral authority and popular support. Maximus was at the center of these efforts, serving as both spiritual guide and practical advisor to an emperor who believed that philosophy and statecraft were inseparable. But Julian's death in 363 CE, fighting against the Persians on the eastern frontier, ended the pagan revival as suddenly as it had begun. The emperor's successors were Christian, and they viewed the men who had guided Julian's anti-Christian policies as dangerous enemies of the new order. Maximus found himself transformed overnight from imperial advisor to suspected traitor, his philosophical practices reinterpreted as seditious magic. The charges brought against Maximus were carefully crafted to exploit contemporary anxieties about the relationship between intellectual and political authority. He was accused of using magical practices to influence imperial policy, of participating in treasonous ceremonies designed to harm Christian rulers, and of maintaining correspondence with Persian enemies of the empire. The specific allegations were probably false, but they reflected real concerns about whether pagan intellectuals could be trusted to serve Christian emperors. The trial that followed was less a legal proceeding than a cultural referendum on the place of pagan philosophy in the Christian empire. The prosecutors argued that theurgy was inherently subversive, that its claims to supernatural power represented a challenge to Christian authority, and that its practitioners formed a kind of secret society that posed ongoing threats to imperial security. The defense countered that philosophical inquiry was compatible with political loyalty, that ancient learning deserved protection even in a Christian state, and that condemning intellectual traditions for their religious associations would impoverish the empire's cultural heritage. What made the case particularly complex was that many of the officials conducting the trial were themselves products of the classical educational system that had produced Maximus. They had studied the same texts, learned the same logical methods, and absorbed the same cultural values that shaped pagan intellectual life. Yet they had also accepted Christian baptism and sworn loyalty to Christian emperors, creating internal tensions that the trial forced them to resolve. The long imprisonment that preceded Maximus's execution was itself a form of torture designed to break his philosophical convictions. He was held in conditions that prevented the ritual practices essential to the urgical discipline, denied access to the books that were the foundation of his intellectual life, and subjected to interrogations intended to demonstrate the powerlessness of his supposed divine connections. It was a systematic attempt to prove that pagan philosophy was nothing more than elaborate self-deception. Yet according to the few surviving accounts, Maximus maintained his composure throughout his imprisonment. He continued to teach fellow prisoners about philosophical topics, to practice meditation and mental exercises that required no external materials, and to demonstrate the kind of intellectual courage that his tradition had always celebrated. His behavior in captivity became its own form of philosophical argumenta, lived demonstration that the values he had taught could survive even the most extreme forms of persecution. The execution, when it finally came, took place at EPHESUS, the same city where Maximus had established his reputation as a master of theurgical arts. The symbolism was deliberate. The place that had witnessed his supposed supernatural triumphs would also witness his very human defeat. The method was probably beheading, the standard punishment for treasonous activities by members of the educated classes. But the death of Maximus marked more than the elimination of an individual political threat. It represented the definitive end of institutional paganism in the Roman Empire, the final severing of the connection between classical philosophy and political power that had existed since the days of Plato's Academy. The intellectual tradition that had produced Aristotle and Plotinus, that had guided Marcus Aurelius and inspired countless generations of students, was being systematically excluded from public life. The broader implications of this exclusion would reshape European intellectual culture for centuries to come. The sophisticated metaphysical systems, the rigorous logical methods, and the spiritual disciplines that had defined late pagan philosophy didn't simply disappear. They were gradually absorbed into Christian theology and transformed into forms that could serve the new religious order. But something was inevitably lost in this process of translation and adaptation. What died with Maximus was the possibility of philosophy as an independent spiritual path, learning as its own form of religious practice, reason as a direct means of accessing divine truth. The Christian empire that emerged from the 4th century religious conflicts would tolerate philosophical inquiry only when it served theological purposes, would support learning only when it reinforced ecclesiastical authority, would permit intellectual sophistication only when it accepted revealed truth as its ultimate foundation. The execution of Maximus thus marked a crucial turning point in the history of Western thought, the moment when philosophy ceased to be a rival to religion and became its handmaiden. The mystical traditions he represented would survive in various forms, influencing medieval Islamic philosophy, Byzantine theology, and Renaissance Hermeticism. But they would never again have the institutional support and cultural authority that they had enjoyed in the pagan empire. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Maximus's fate was how it illustrated the impossibility of maintaining intellectual neutrality in times of religious and political transformation. He had devoted his life to philosophical pursuits that seemed to transcend immediate political concerns, seeking truth through methods that had been developed over centuries of careful reflection and experimentation. Yet, when the cultural foundation that supported such pursuits shifted, he found himself forced to choose between his intellectual convictions and his physical survival. The choice he made to maintain his philosophical commitments despite the mortal consequence established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the subsequent history of Western thought. From Boethius to Giordano Bruno, from Thomas More to the victims of 20th century totalitarianism, intellectuals would face similar moments when abstract philosophical principles demanded concrete personal sacrifices. In death, Maximus became a symbol of the costs associated with intellectual and spiritual independence. His execution reminded future generations that the pursuit of wisdom, however abstract it might appear, always takes place within specific political and cultural contexts that can make such pursuits dangerous. The mystic who had claimed direct access to divine truth had discovered that earthly power could still destroy those who challenged its authority. The twilight of paganism that his death represented was also the dawn of a new intellectual order that would dominate European thought for over a millennium. The Christian empire that killed him would preserve and transmit much of the classical learning he had represented, but always within frameworks that subordinated philosophical inquiry to religious authority. The question of whether this transformation represented progress or decline would continue to divide thinkers long after both paganism and the classical Christian synthesis had passed into history. Hypatia wisdom amid violence. Alexandria, in 415 CE, was a city at war with itself. The great metropolis that had once been the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world, home to the greatest library in antiquity and the meeting place of Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish learning, had become a battleground where competing versions of Christianity fought for control with weapons, both theological and physical. In this atmosphere of sectarian violence and political chaos, being a prominent intellectual was as dangerous as being a political leader, perhaps more so. Hypatia had inherited her position at the center of Alexandria's intellectual life from her father Theon, who had been the city's leading mathematician and astronomer for decades. But she had transcended his achievements to become something unprecedented in the ancient world. A woman who commanded respect as a philosopher, scientist, and teacher from the most educated men of her generation. Her public lectures on Platonic philosophy drew audiences from across the Eastern Mediterranean, and her private instruction in mathematics and astronomy shaped the minds of students who would go on to become bishops, governors, and imperial officials. The Alexandria, where Hypatia taught, was a very different place from the cosmopolitan center of learning that had flourished under the Ptolemies. The great library had been declining for centuries, its collections scattered or destroyed by fire, warfare, and deliberate vandalism. The museum, where generations of scholars had pursued research under royal patronage, had long since lost its funding and institutional support. What remained was a shadow of the former intellectual glory, maintained by individual scholars like Hypatia, who continued the traditions of classical learning despite the lack of institutional framework. But the decay of classical institutions had been accompanied by the rise of new forms of intellectual and spiritual authority. Alexandria had become one of the most important centers of Christian theology, home to bishops whose interpretations of doctrine influenced believers throughout the empire. The city's large Jewish population maintained its own scholarly traditions, while various Christian sects competed for adherence with arguments that mixed theological sophistication with street-level politics. Into this volatile mixture, Hypatia introduced a complicating factor that many found threatening: the voice of secular reason applied to ultimate questions. Her philosophical teaching drew heavily on Plotinus and other Neoplatonic thinkers who had developed sophisticated systems for understanding the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. But unlike Christian theologians, she approached these questions through purely rational methods, without reference to revealed scripture or ecclesiastical authority. This approach attracted students from all the city's diverse communities. Christians came to learn mathematical techniques that would help them calculate Easter dates more accurately. Pagans found in her teaching a continuation of the classical tradition that connected them to centuries of Greek intellectual achievement. Even some Jews attended her lectures, drawn by her reputation for logical rigor and her willingness to engage seriously with different philosophical perspectives. But the very diversity of her audience made Hypatia a symbol of everything that Christian leaders found problematic about Alexandria's intellectual culture. In their view, the city's problems stemmed from its refusal to acknowledge that divine revelation had superseded human reason as the source of ultimate truth. As long as prominent figures like Hypatia continued to attract followers through purely secular teaching, Alexandria would remain divided against itself, unable to achieve the unity that only Christian faith could provide. The specific political crisis that led to Hypatia's murder grew out of a conflict between Cyril, the city's Christian bishop, and Orestes, the imperial prefect who represented secular authority in the province. Both men were ambitious, intelligent, and completely convinced of their own righteousness exactly, the combination that made compromise impossible and violence inevitable. Their dispute ostensibly concerned the treatment of Alexandria's Jewish population, but it really reflected deeper disagreements about the proper relationship between religious and secular power. Hypatia's involvement in this conflict was probably unavoidable, given her position and relationships. She had been a friend and teacher of Orestes, had influenced his understanding of philosophical and mathematical questions, and continued to serve as an informal advisor on issues that required technical expertise. In the polarized atmosphere of 415, such connections made her appear to be a partisan of the prefect's faction rather than the neutral intellectual she probably saw herself as being. From Bishop Cyril's perspective, Hypatia represented everything that made Orestes dangerous to Christian unity. Here was a woman who commanded intellectual authority without acknowledging ecclesiastical oversight, who taught philosophical doctrines that competed with Christian theology, and who had apparently used her influence to encourage the prefect's resistance to episcopal authority. As long as such figures remained prominent in Alexandria's public life, the bishop's efforts to create a unified Christian city would face systematic opposition. The propaganda campaign that preceded Hypatia's murder was carefully designed to transform a respected teacher into a figure of popular hatred. Rumors spread through Alexandria's Christian communities that she practiced magic, that her philosophical teaching was really a cover for demonic activities, and that her influence over government officials posed a direct threat to the safety of Christian believers. Whether Cyril actively encouraged such rumors or simply failed to discourage them remains a matter of historical debate. But the effect was to create an atmosphere where violence against Hypatia seemed not only justified but religiously necessary. The mob that attacked her in March 415 was composed primarily of Parabalani Christian monks and lay workers who were supposed to care for the sick and poor, but who had become increasingly involved in the bishop's political activities. These men saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, defending the faith against enemies who used intellectual sophistication to undermine divine truth. The violence they employed was not random street crime, but organized religious warfare conducted by people who believed they were doing God's work. The attack itself took place as Hypatia was traveling through the city in her customary way, probably returning from one of her teaching sessions. The mob surrounded her carriage, dragged her to a Christian church called the Caesareum, and there subjected her to torture and murder that contemporary sources describe in terms too brutal to be easily dismissed as rhetorical exaggeration. She was stripped naked, beaten with tiles or pottery shards, and finally dismembered, her body parts scattered throughout the city. The choice of the Caesareum as the site for this violence was symbolically significant. This building had originally been constructed as a temple to the divine Augustus, representing the religious dimension of imperial authority. It had later been converted to Christian use, serving as one of Alexandria's most important churches. By murdering Hypatia in such a place, her killers were making a statement about the triumph of Christian truth over both pagan philosophy and secular authority. But the symbolism cut both ways. The image of a respected teacher being tortured to death in a house of worship created exactly the kind of scandal that thoughtful Christians found deeply disturbing. Even contemporaries who shared Cyril's theological views recognized that Hypatia's murder represented a betrayal of the Christian values of mercy and justice that were supposed to distinguish the new faith from pagan brutality. The immediate aftermath of the murder revealed the extent to which Alexandria's intellectual community had been traumatized by the violence. Many of Hypatia's students and colleagues fled the city, taking with them mathematical and philosophical knowledge that would be lost to the West for centuries. The classical tradition of scholarship that she had represented effectively ended in Alexandria, not through gradual decline, but through sudden, deliberate destruction. The broader implications of Hypatia's death extended far beyond Alexandria to influence the development of European intellectual culture for centuries to come. Her murder became a symbol of the conflicts between reason and faith, secular learning and religious authority that would define medieval thought. Later generations of scholars would look back to her death as marking the end of the classical world and the beginning of a new era in which intellectual inquiry was subordinated to theological control. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Hypatia's legacy was how her death illuminated the particular dangers faced by women who claimed intellectual authority in male-dominated societies. The violence directed against her was not simply religious or political, but also gendered an expression of deep anxieties about women who transgressed traditional boundaries by teaching men, influencing public policy, and claiming expertise in areas that were supposed to be exclusively masculine domains. The fact that she was stripped naked before being killed was not accidental, but reflected specific beliefs about the relationship between female sexuality and intellectual authority. In the minds of her attackers, a woman who taught philosophy was inherently subversive, not just because of what she taught, but because of who she was, someone who challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and social hierarchy simply by existing as a prominent intellectual figure. Yet Hypatia's death also demonstrated something remarkable about the power of learning and teaching to transcend social conventions. Despite the enormous obstacles she faced as a woman in a male-dominated intellectual culture, she had managed to establish herself as one of the most respected philosophers and mathematicians of her generation. Her students revered her not despite her gender, but because of her extraordinary abilities as a teacher and thinker. The classical tradition that died with Hypatia in Alexandria would eventually be revived during the Renaissance by scholars who saw in her story both an inspiration and a warning. Her example showed that intellectual excellence could overcome social prejudice, but her fate demonstrated that such achievements remained vulnerable to political and religious violence. The tension between these lessons would continue to influence European thought long after the specific circumstances that led to her death had been forgotten. In the end, Hypatia's murder represented more than the death of an individual, however remarkable. It marked the violent end of an entire approach to learning that had valued inquiry over orthodoxy, reason over revelation, and intellectual freedom over social conformity. The world that emerged from the ashes of classical Alexandria would be different in fundamental ways, more unified perhaps, but also more constrained in its willingness to follow ideas wherever they might lead. Sopater of APAMEA, the clogged aqueduct mystery. Constantinople in 330 CE was a city caught between worlds, no longer the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, not yet the great Christian capital it would become, but something entirely new and unprecedented. Constantine the Great had chosen this site for his new Rome with the eye of a military engineer and the ambition of a second founder of civilization. But founding cities, as any student of history knows, is easier than sustaining them, and the practical problems of urban life have a way of overwhelming even the grandest imperial visions. The water supply that fed Constantinople was one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world, a complex system of aqueducts, cisterns, and distribution channels that brought fresh water from sources dozens of miles away. But in the summer of 331, this system began to fail in ways that baffled the best technical minds in the empire. The flow of water slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether, leaving hundreds of thousands of residents dependent on whatever they could draw from wells, collect from rain, or purchase from water sellers at exorbitant prices. The technical investigation that followed revealed nothing obviously wrong with the infrastructure. The aqueducts themselves appeared intact, the distribution system showed no signs of damage, and the source springs continued to flow as they had for centuries. Yet somehow, the water was not reaching the city in adequate quantities. It was exactly the kind of mysterious failure that ancient minds were inclined to attribute to supernatural causes, divine punishment for unknown sins, or malevolent magic directed by human enemies. Into this atmosphere of confusion and growing desperation came whispers about Sopater of Apamea, the Neoplatonic philosopher who had become one of Constantine's most trusted advisors. Sopater had followed his master Iamblichus in developing sophisticated theories about the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds, arguing that properly trained philosophers could influence physical events through ritualistic practices that aligned human will with cosmic forces. To those looking for someone to blame for Constantinople's water crisis, such theories sounded suspiciously like admissions of guilt. Sopater had come to Constantinople as part of Constantine's broader effort to recruit the best intellectual talent for his new capital. The emperor understood that cities were made great not just by their architecture and administration, but by their cultural institutions, the schools, libraries, and philosophical circles that attracted students and scholars from across the known world. In Sopater, he had found someone who combined impressive philosophical credentials with practical wisdom about governance and administration. The relationship between emperor and philosopher had initially been mutually beneficial. Constantine gained access to intellectual frameworks that helped him understand the theological and philosophical challenges posed by his conversion to Christianity. Sopater found himself in the unprecedented position of being able to influence imperial policy according to principles derived from centuries of Greek philosophical reflection. It was exactly the kind of synthesis between wisdom and power that philosophers from Plato onward had dreamed about achieving. But such relationships carried enormous risks for both parties. Constantine's embrace of Christianity had created expectations among his new co-religionists that imperial policy would consistently favor their interests over those of competing groups. The emperor's continued reliance on pagan advisors like Sopater suggested either that his conversion was incomplete or that he was unwilling to accept the full implications of his new faith. Either interpretation created political problems that would eventually demand resolution. The water crisis provided Constantine's critics with exactly the kind of concrete issue they needed to challenge his philosophical advisors. Here was a practical problem that seemed to have no technical solution, occurring in a city that was supposed to represent the triumph of Christian civilization over pagan decadence. The suggestion that Sopater had somehow bewitched the aqueducts through magical practices offered a simple explanation for an otherwise incomprehensible situation. The specific allegations against Sopater reflected contemporary beliefs about the relationship between philosophical learning and magical practice. Neoplatonic philosophy, with its emphasis on the spiritual dimensions of material reality and its sophisticated ritualistic practices, looked to Christian critics like elaborate sorcery, dressed up in intellectual pretensions. The claim that Sopater had used his knowledge to interfere with Constantinople's water supply was plausible to people who already suspected that pagan philosophy was really a form of demon worship. What made these accusations particularly dangerous was that they came at a time when Constantine was under enormous pressure to demonstrate his Christian orthodoxy. The emperor had postponed his baptism for political reasons, maintaining flexibility in his religious commitments while he consolidated power and built his new capital. But such flexibility was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain as Christian bishops demanded clearer evidence of imperial devotion to their cause. The court intrigue that surrounded Sopater's downfall reveals much about the political dynamics of the early Christian empire. His enemies were not necessarily motivated by religious conviction, but by practical concerns about access to imperial favor and influence over policy decisions. In the zero-sum world of court politics, eliminating a prominent pagan advisor created opportunities for Christian courtiers to advance their own careers while demonstrating their theological reliability. The investigation into Sopater's alleged magical activities was conducted according to legal procedures that were designed more to produce confessions than to determine facts. Roman law had always been suspicious of magical practices, but the specific methods used to investigate such crimes, including torture, the testimony of slaves against their masters, and the acceptance of evidence that would have been inadmissible in other contexts, made conviction almost inevitable once charges were brought. Sopater's defense strategy appears to have been based on the reasonable assumption that philosophical activity and magical practice were clearly distinguishable categories that no educated person would confuse. He argued that his theoretical writings and teaching activities were part of a legitimate intellectual tradition that posed no threat to imperial authority or public safety. The rituals associated with Neoplatonic philosophy were spiritual exercises designed to purify the soul, not practical techniques for manipulating material reality. But this defense missed the political dimension of his situation. The question was not really whether Sopater had actually bewitched Constantinople's aqueducts, an allegation that was probably as absurd to his prosecutors as it was to him, but whether Constantine could afford to continue protecting pagan advisors when such protection carried increasing political costs. From this perspective, Sopater's guilt or innocence was less important than the symbolic value of his punishment. The execution, when it finally came, was swift and relatively merciful by the standards of the time. Sopater was beheaded as befitted his social status, avoiding the more elaborate tortures that were typically inflicted on those convicted of magical crimes. But the political message was unmistakable. The new Christian empire would not tolerate the kind of intellectual independence that pagan philosophy represented, regardless of the personal relationships or practical benefits that had previously protected such figures. The broader significance of Sopater's death extended far beyond the immediate circumstances that caused it. His execution marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between intellectual authority and political power in the post-Constantine world. The synthesis between Greek philosophical wisdom and Roman administrative efficiency that had characterized the best of pagan imperial culture was being systematically dismantled in favor of a new order that subordinated all forms of learning to Christian theological authority. Perhaps most importantly, Sopater's fate illustrated how superstition and paranoia could triumph over rational investigation, even in societies that prided themselves on their sophistication and learning. The water crisis that led to his death was eventually resolved through conventional engineering solutions, cleaning sediment from distribution channels, repairing damaged sections of aqueduct, and improving maintenance procedures. But by the time these technical fixes were implemented, the philosopher who had been blamed for the problem was already dead. The mystery of Constantinople's aqueducts thus became a parable about the dangers of seeking supernatural explanations for natural phenomena, and the even greater dangers of allowing political expedience to override intellectual honesty. Sopater had died not because he was guilty of the magical practices attributed to him, but because his death served the immediate political needs of people who found his continued existence inconvenient. In the end, the clogged aqueduct that had supposedly been the instrument of Sopater's magical malevolence became a symbol of the intellectual blockages that were beginning to characterize the early Christian empire. Just as the physical infrastructure required constant maintenance to function properly, the intellectual infrastructure of civilization needed protection from the kind of superstition and political manipulation that had destroyed one of its most distinguished representatives. The lesson was clear, but it would take centuries for later generations to fully understand its implications. Al-HALLAJ. I am the truth. Baghdad in 922 CE was the beating heart of the Islamic world, a city where the wealth of 3 continents flowed together, and where scholars from Spain to Central Asia gathered to debate questions that touched the very foundations of existence. The Abbasid Caliphate was at its intellectual zenith, having absorbed and transformed the learning of conquered civilizations into something that was both distinctively Islamic and remarkably cosmopolitan. But beneath this surface of prosperity and cultural achievement lay deep tensions about the proper relationship between rational inquiry and divine revelation, between individual spiritual experience and collective religious authority. Mansur al-HALLAJ had been born into this world of intellectual ferment around 858 CE in the Persian province of Fars, where Sufi mysticism was beginning to develop its most sophisticated theoretical frameworks. His given name, al-HALLAJ, meant the cotton carder, a reference to his family's humble origins in the textile trade. But the man who would bear this name would spin threads of meaning that connected earth to heaven, human consciousness to divine reality, in ways that both enchanted and terrified those who encountered his teachings. The Sufism that shaped al-HALLAJ's spiritual development was not the organized movement of later centuries, but rather a loose collection of individuals and small groups who sought direct experience of divine truth through disciplined spiritual practice. These early mystics combined rigorous adherence to Islamic law with innovative techniques of meditation, prayer, and self-examination that were designed to purify the heart and prepare it for divine illumination. It was a demanding path that required its practitioners to abandon conventional attachments to wealth, status, and even family in pursuit of ultimate reality. Al-HALLAJ's early career followed the typical pattern of Sufi development. He studied with recognized masters, undertook extended periods of retreat and contemplation, and gradually developed his own understanding of the spiritual techniques that could lead to mystical realization. His reputation as a teacher and guide grew slowly but steadily, attracting students who were drawn by his obvious sincerity and his ability to articulate experiences that most people could barely imagine. But al-HALLAJ's approach to Sufism contained elements that made orthodox authorities increasingly uncomfortable. While most mystics emphasized the absolute transcendence of God and the corresponding humility required of human seekers, al-HALLAJ taught that the ultimate goal of spiritual practice was the complete dissolution of the individual self into divine reality. At the highest stages of mystical realization, he argued, the distinction between the seeker and the sought disappeared entirely, leaving only pure divine consciousness. This teaching led al-HALLAJ to make statements that shocked even sympathetic listeners. During periods of mystical ecstasy, he would declare, "Ana al-Haq, I am the truth," using one of the Quranic names for God to describe his own state of consciousness. To those who understood the technical vocabulary of Sufi psychology, such utterances represented descriptions of temporary mystical states rather than claims to permanent divine status. But to Orthodox Muslims who lacked such understanding, they sounded like the worst kind of blasphemy. The controversy surrounding al-HALLAJ was intensified by his refusal to restrict his teaching to small circles of initiated disciples. Unlike most Sufi masters, who carefully selected their students and revealed advanced teachings only to those who had demonstrated their readiness, al-HALLAJ taught publicly, attracting large crowds and speaking openly about mystical experiences that were traditionally considered too dangerous for general audiences. His charismatic personality and powerful oratory made him a popular figure, but they also made him a target for those who believed that religious authority should be exercised through established institutions rather than individual inspiration. The political context that surrounded al-HALLAJ's career was crucial to understanding his ultimate fate. The Abbasid Caliphate was experiencing internal tensions that went to the heart of Islamic civilization's self-understanding. The caliphs themselves had become increasingly removed from actual governance, leaving practical authority in the hands of military commanders and administrative officials who were often more concerned with maintaining power than with advancing religious goals. At the same time, various scholarly and mystical movements were developing teachings that seemed to challenge the caliph's claims to religious leadership. The specific charges brought against al-HALLAJ were carefully designed to exploit these political anxieties. He was accused of claiming divine status for himself, of teaching doctrines that contradicted fundamental Islamic beliefs, and of encouraging followers to abandon their religious and social obligations in pursuit of mystical experiences. More ominously, he was also charged with seditious activities, allegedly encouraging rebellion against legitimate authority and maintaining correspondence with enemies of the Abbasid state. The trial that followed was as much a theological examination as a legal proceeding. Leading scholars were called to testify about the orthodoxy of Al-HALLAJ teachings, and his own writings and recorded statements were subjected to detailed analysis. The process revealed deep divisions within the Islamic intellectual community about the proper limits of mystical speculation and the relationship between esoteric spiritual teachings and exoteric religious law. Some of the most distinguished scholars of the age defended Al-HALLAJ, arguing that his apparently blasphemous statements should be understood within the context of Sufi, technical vocabulary, rather than interpreted according to their literal meaning. They pointed out that the Quran itself contained passages that could be misunderstood if read without proper knowledge of their spiritual significance, and they argued that condemning mystical utterances based on superficial interpretation would set a dangerous precedent for restricting legitimate spiritual inquiry. But other equally respected authorities took the opposite position, arguing that Al-HALLAJ public statements represented clear violations of Islamic monotheism, regardless of how they might be interpreted within specialized mystical contexts. They contended that allowing such utterances to go unpunished would encourage others to make similar claims, potentially leading to the fragmentation of Islamic religious authority and the emergence of multiple competing sources of divine guidance. The decade-long imprisonment that preceded Al-HALLAJ's execution became itself a form of spiritual test that he approached with the same intensity he had brought to his mystical practices. According to accounts from visitors and correspondents, he used his confinement as an opportunity for extended contemplation and continued teaching, maintaining his spiritual disciplines despite the harsh conditions and uncertain future he faced. The letters and poems that Al-HALLAJ composed during his imprisonment represent some of the most profound expressions of mystical experience in all of Islamic literature. They combine passionate devotion with intellectual sophistication, personal anguish with universal insight, in ways that continue to move readers a millennium after their composition. These works demonstrate that whatever his fate in the external world, Al-HALLAJ had achieved the inner freedom that was the ultimate goal of Sufi practice. The execution itself, carried out on March 26, 922 CE, was designed to be both a punishment and a public spectacle. Al-HALLAJ was taken to a scaffold erected near the Tigris River, where large crowds had gathered to witness the death of the man who had claimed divine identity. The method chosen was particularly brutal, was first flogged, then had his hands and feet amputated, and finally was beheaded and his body burned, with the ashes scattered in the river to prevent the creation of a martyr's shrine. But the authorities' attempt to eliminate Al-HALLAJ's influence through physical destruction proved counterproductive. The manner of his death, carried out with a determination that seemed to exceed what his actual crimes warranted, convinced many observers that they were witnessing the persecution of a genuine saint rather than the punishment of a dangerous heretic. The image of the mystic maintaining his spiritual composure while being tortured to death became a powerful symbol of the soul's capacity to transcend physical suffering through divine grace. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the extent to which Al-HALLAJ had divided the Islamic intellectual community. Some scholars and officials who had supported his condemnation began to express doubts about the justice of his punishment, while others defended the execution as necessary for maintaining religious order. The controversy continued for generations, with each new generation of Muslim thinkers forced to confront the question of how to balance mystical freedom with institutional authority. The broader significance of Al-HALLAJ's death extended far beyond the immediate religious and political circumstances that caused it. His execution established precedents for how Islamic authorities would deal with mystical teachers whose experiences seemed to transcend conventional religious categories. The tension between esoteric spiritual insight and exoteric religious law that his case had highlighted would continue to influence Islamic intellectual life for centuries to come. Perhaps most importantly, Al-HALLAJ's fate illustrated the inherent difficulty of communicating mystical experiences through ordinary language. His declaration, "I am the truth," had been intended to describe a temporary state of mystical realization, but it had been interpreted as a permanent claim to divine status. The gap between mystical experience and verbal expression that his case revealed would become a central preoccupation of later Sufi theorists, who developed increasingly sophisticated methods for discussing spiritual states without falling into the kind of linguistic traps that had destroyed their predecessor. The poetic legacy that Al-HALLAJ left behind proved more durable than the institutional authorities that had condemned him. His verses, with their passionate exploration of divine love and mystical union, influenced generations of Persian, Arabic, and Turkish poets, who found in his example both inspiration and warning. The tradition of mystical poetry that emerged from his work would become one of the greatest achievements of Islamic civilization, demonstrating that even in death, Al-HALLAJ had achieved the kind of lasting influence that transcends political persecution. In the end, the man who had declared himself to be the truth had discovered a truth that his executioners couldn't comprehend. That authentic spiritual realization creates its own authority, independent of any institutional recognition or approval. His death had been intended to demonstrate the powerlessness of individual mystical experience against collective religious authority, but it had instead revealed the opposite, that genuine spiritual insight possesses a transformative power that can survive any form of persecution and continue to influence human consciousness long after its original vehicle has been destroyed. AL-QUZAT Hamadani, youthful mystic rebel. The Seljuk Empire, in the early 12th century, was a civilization caught between conflicting impulses, the mystical longing for divine union that had become central to Islamic spirituality, and the legalistic emphasis on external conformity that religious authorities used to maintain social order. This tension was particularly acute in Persia, where Sufi mysticism had developed its most sophisticated theoretical frameworks, while simultaneously attracting the suspicion of orthodox scholars who saw in mystical claims a dangerous challenge to established religious authority. Al-QUZAT Hamadani was born into this atmosphere of spiritual ferment around 1098 CE in the Persian city of Hamadan, where his family occupied a respected position in the scholarly establishment. His full name, Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Ahmad Abul Ma'ali, reflected the conventional expectations that surrounded his birth. He was destined to become another in a long line of religious scholars who would interpret established traditions rather than challenge them. But the young man who bore this name would follow a very different path, one that led from the security of orthodox learning to the dangerous heights of mystical realization. The educational system that shaped Al-QUZAT's early development was designed to produce competent religious functionaries rather than original thinkers. Students memorized vast quantities of Quranic text and legal commentary, learned to apply established principles to practical problems, and absorbed the cultural assumptions that made Islamic civilization coherent across its vast geographical extent. It was a system that valued precision over creativity, conformity over innovation, and collective wisdom over individual insight. But Al-QUZAT possessed the kind of restless intelligence that couldn't be satisfied with conventional answers to ultimate questions. While his contemporaries were content to master existing commentaries on religious law, he was drawn to the works of mystics like Al-HALLAJ and Abu Yazid al-Bistami, who claimed direct experience of divine reality rather than merely intellectual understanding of divine attributes. By his early 20s, he had already established a reputation as a brilliant scholar, but one whose interests lay in exploring the experimental margins of Islamic spirituality rather than defending its established centers. The Sufism that attracted AL-QUZAT was not the institutionalized mysticism of later centuries, but rather the radical spiritual experimentation of the early masters, who had been willing to risk everything in pursuit of divine truth. These figures had developed practices and teachings that pushed human consciousness to its absolute limits, exploring states of awareness that transcended ordinary categories of thought and experience. It was a dangerous path that required its practitioners to abandon conventional securities in favor of direct encounter with ultimate reality. The specific form of mystical practice that AL-QUZAT developed emphasized the complete dissolution of individual consciousness into divine awareness. Like AL-HALLAJ before him, he taught that the ultimate goal of spiritual development was not simply the purification of the ego, but its complete annihilation in divine truth. This was a teaching that went far beyond what most religious authorities considered acceptable, suggesting as it did that human beings could achieve a kind of union with God that seemed to compromise divine transcendence. The political context that surrounded AL-QUZAT's career was crucial to understanding his ultimate fate. The Seljuk Empire was experiencing internal tensions that reflected broader conflicts within Islamic civilization about the proper relationship between spiritual authority and political power. Local rulers were increasingly asserting their independence from distant caliphal authority, while religious scholars were developing teachings that seemed to challenge established sources of social order. The charges brought against AL-QUZAT were similar to those that had been used against AL-HALLAJ 2 centuries earlier, but they were formulated with greater legal sophistication. He was accused of teaching doctrines that contradicted fundamental Islamic beliefs, of encouraging followers to abandon their religious obligations, and of claiming spiritual authority that belonged only to recognized prophets and saints. More specifically, his writings were said to contain statements that suggested the possibility of direct divine revelation to ordinary believers, potentially undermining the exclusive authority of the Quran and established religious leadership. The trial that followed revealed the extent to which Islamic intellectual life had become divided between those who saw mystical experience as the ultimate goal of religious practice and those who viewed it as a dangerous deviation from established norms. The prosecution was led by scholars who genuinely believed that AL-QUZAT's teachings represented a threat to the foundations of Islamic civilization, while the defense was supported by mystics and sympathetic scholars who argued that authentic spiritual experience had always been central to Islamic tradition. What made the case particularly complex was AL-QUZAT's youth. He was only 33 when he was executed, making him one of the youngest figures in the history of martyred philosophers. His age made his claims to advanced mystical realization seem presumptuous to older scholars who had spent decades studying religious texts without claiming the kind of direct spiritual authority that AL-QUZAT asserted. At the same time, his obvious intelligence and evident sincerity made it difficult to dismiss him as simply another deluded enthusiast. The secret nature of the trial reflected the political sensitivities surrounding the case. Unlike AL-HALLAJ's very public examination, AL-QUZAT's proceedings were conducted away from popular attention, probably because the authorities feared that his charismatic personality and powerful oratory might generate sympathy among the general population. The secrecy also reflected concerns about the international implications of the case. AL-QUZAT had correspondence throughout the Islamic world, and his execution might provoke criticism from other centers of Islamic learning. The letters that AL-QUZAT wrote during his imprisonment and trial represent some of the most profound expressions of mystical experience and social criticism in Persian literature. These works combine passionate spiritual devotion with sharp analysis of the political and religious conditions that had led to his persecution. They demonstrate that his mystical claims were accompanied by sophisticated understanding of the social forces that made such claims dangerous to established authorities. One of the most remarkable aspects of these letters is how they connect mystical experience with social justice concerns in ways that anticipated later developments in Islamic political thought. AL-QUZAT argued that authentic spiritual realization naturally led to criticism of social arrangements that perpetuated injustice and inequality. He suggested that the same religious authorities who persecuted mystics were often complicit in maintaining political systems that oppressed the poor and powerless. This connection between mysticism and social criticism made AL-QUZAT's teachings particularly threatening to established authorities. If authentic spiritual experience led inevitably to criticism of existing social arrangements, then encouraging such experience was tantamount to promoting political rebellion. From this perspective, executing mystical teachers was not religious persecution but rather legitimate self-defense by authorities whose power depended on maintaining existing inequalities. The hanging that ended AL-QUZAT's life was carried out with the efficiency that characterized Seljuk administration, but it failed to achieve its intended purpose of silencing his influence. The manner of his death, like that of AL-HALLAJ before him, convinced many observers that they were witnessing the persecution of authentic holiness rather than the punishment of dangerous heresy. The image of a young mystic dying for his spiritual convictions became a powerful symbol that inspired later generations of Sufi teachers and social critics. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed deep divisions within the Persian intellectual community about the proper limits of mystical speculation and the relationship between spiritual authority and political power. Some scholars who had remained silent during the trial began to express regret about the outcome, while others defended the execution as necessary for maintaining religious order. The controversy continued for generations, with each new cohort of Persian intellectuals forced to confront the questions that AL-QUZAT's case had raised. The broader significance of his death extended far beyond the immediate circumstances that caused it. The execution established precedents for how Islamic authorities would deal with mystical teachers who combined spiritual claims with social criticism. The pattern that emerged initial tolerance, followed by increasing suspicion and eventual violent suppression, would be repeated in numerous other cases throughout Islamic history. Perhaps most importantly, AL-QUZAT's fate illustrated the inherent tension between individual spiritual experience and collective religious authority that would continue to challenge Islamic civilization for centuries to come. His claim that authentic mystical realization led to criticism of unjust social arrangements suggested that there might be fundamental conflicts between the spiritual goals of Islam and the political structures that governed Islamic societies. The literary legacy that AL-QUZAT left behind proved more durable than the authorities that condemned him. His letters and treatises, with their unique combination of mystical insight and social analysis, influenced generations of Persian writers who found in his example both inspiration and warning. The tradition of mystical literature that emerged from his work would become one of the distinctive achievements of Persian Islamic culture, demonstrating that even in death, he had achieved the kind of lasting influence that transcends immediate political circumstances. In the end, the youthful mystic who had challenged both religious orthodoxy and social injustice had discovered a truth that his executioners couldn't comprehend: that authentic spiritual experience creates its own authority, and that this authority cannot be destroyed by external force. His death had been intended to demonstrate the powerlessness of individual mystical claims against established religious and political order, but it had instead revealed the transformative power of spiritual conviction to inspire resistance to injustice and oppression across the centuries. Suhrawardi, the philosopher of light, extinguished. Aleppo in 1191 CE stood at the crossroads of civilizations, a city where the intellectual traditions of ancient Greece, the mystical insights of Islamic spirituality, and the practical demands of medieval politics intersected in ways that could either produce remarkable synthesis or dangerous conflict. The Ayyubid dynasty that ruled from Damascus had established a delicate balance between military efficiency and cultural sophistication, attracting scholars and artists from across the Islamic world, while maintaining the constant vigilance required to defend against crusader attacks and internal rebellion. Yahya ibn Habash al-Suhrawardi, known to later generations as Sheikh al-Ishraq, the master of illumination, had arrived in Aleppo carrying intellectual credentials that would have impressed any court in the medieval world. By the age of 36, he had already mastered the major works of Aristotelian philosophy, absorbed the mystical teachings of Islamic Sufism, and developed an original philosophical system that attempted to synthesize rational inquiry with direct spiritual experience in ways that had never been attempted before. The philosophical system that Suhrawardi called Illuminationism represented one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the medieval period. Drawing on sources that ranged from Plato and Plotinus to Zoroastrian light mysticism and Islamic revelation, he argued that reality consisted of various levels of light and darkness, with pure divine light at the apex of existence and material darkness at its base. Human consciousness, he taught, was itself a form of light that could be purified through philosophical study and mystical practice until it achieved direct illumination of divine truth. This was not merely abstract metaphysical speculation, but a practical system designed to guide serious students through specific stages of intellectual and spiritual development. Suhrawardi's works contain detailed instructions for meditation practices, logical exercises, and contemplative techniques that were supposed to prepare the mind for the kind of direct intuitive knowledge that transcended ordinary discursive reasoning. It was philosophy as spiritual discipline, learning as a path to enlightenment, reason as a means of transcending the limitations of rational thought itself. The court of al-Malik al-Zahir, the Ayyubid prince who ruled Aleppo, was exactly the kind of environment where such philosophical ambitions might be expected to flourish. The prince himself was an educated man who appreciated intellectual sophistication and who understood that attracting prominent scholars enhanced his prestige throughout the Islamic world. His court included mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and poets who created the kind of stimulating intellectual atmosphere that had made Islamic civilization the envy of medieval Europe. But the same qualities that made Suhrawardi's philosophy attractive to educated audiences also made it threatening to religious authorities who were responsible for maintaining orthodox belief and social order. His claim that philosophical study could lead to direct knowledge of divine truth seemed to bypass the established channels of religious authority. The Quran, the prophetic traditions, and the scholarly consensus that was supposed to guide Muslim belief and practice. If individual philosophers could achieve illumination through their own efforts, what need was there for the institutional structures that had developed over centuries to preserve and transmit Islamic teaching? The specific charges brought against Suhrawardi reflected these broader concerns about the relationship between individual spiritual experience and collective religious authority. He was accused of teaching doctrines that contradicted established Islamic beliefs, of claiming knowledge that was supposed to be available only through divine revelation, and of encouraging practices that might lead followers away from their religious obligations. More ominously, he was also charged with reviving pre-Islamic Persian religious traditions that had been superseded by the revelation of the Quran. This last accusation was particularly serious because it touched on sensitive questions about the relationship between Islamic civilization and the pre-Islamic cultures it had absorbed. Suhrawardi's philosophy did indeed draw heavily on Zoroastrian light symbolism and ancient Persian cosmology, but he argued that these traditions contained authentic insights into divine truth that complemented rather than contradicted Islamic revelation. His critics contended that such syncretism represented a dangerous dilution of Islamic purity that could lead to the revival of polytheistic beliefs. The trial that followed was complicated by the political pressures surrounding the Ayyubid court. Al-Malik al-Zahir was the son of Salah ad-Din, the great Kurdish leader who had recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders and established the Ayyubid dynasty as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean. But the prince's position in Aleppo was somewhat precarious, needed to maintain good relations with the religious establishment in Damascus, while also asserting his independence as a ruler in his own right. The intervention of his father, Salah ad-Din, proved decisive in determining Suhrawadi's fate. According to most historical accounts, the Sultan initially favored clemency, recognizing that executing a prominent philosopher might damage the dynasty's reputation for cultural patronage. But the pressure from religious authorities throughout the Ayyubid domains was intense, and various scholars argued that allowing Suhrawadi's teachings to spread unchecked would undermine the religious foundations of Islamic society. The final order for Suhrawadi's execution reportedly came in the form of a letter from Salah ad-Din to his son, instructing him that the philosopher must die quietly to avoid creating a public spectacle that might generate sympathy for his cause. This phrasing suggests that the authorities understood exactly what they were destroying, not a dangerous heretic whose elimination would be universally welcomed, but a brilliant thinker whose death might be seen as martyrdom by those who shared his intellectual interests. The execution itself was carried out with the discretion that the political situation required. Unlike the public spectacles that had marked the deaths of Al-HALLAJ and AL-QUZAT, Suhrawadi's elimination was handled quietly, probably through strangulation or some other method that would avoid attracting public attention. The authorities were determined to eliminate his influence without creating the kind of dramatic martyrdom that might inspire future followers. But their attempt to limit the impact of his death proved unsuccessful. The very secrecy that surrounded his execution convinced many contemporaries that the authorities had something to hide, that they had eliminated Suhrawadi not because his teachings were obviously false, but because they were uncomfortably compelling. The image of a brilliant philosopher being quietly murdered for his ideas became a powerful symbol that inspired later generations of Islamic intellectuals who faced similar conflicts between philosophical inquiry and religious orthodoxy. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed the extent to which Suhrawadi's work had already influenced Islamic intellectual life. His students, scattered throughout the Eastern Islamic world, continued to study and transmit his writings despite the obvious dangers such activities entailed. The philosophical system he had developed proved remarkably durable, influencing later developments in Islamic philosophy, mysticism, and even theology in ways that his executioners could never have anticipated. The geographical spread of illuminationist philosophy demonstrated the international character of medieval Islamic intellectual culture. While Suhrawadi had been eliminated in Aleppo, his ideas found fertile ground in Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, where scholars were either beyond the reach of Ayyubid authority or operating under political systems that were more tolerant of philosophical innovation. The result was the development of a philosophical tradition that would influence Islamic thought for centuries to come. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transmission was how Suhrawadi's ideas were adapted to different cultural and political contexts while maintaining their essential character. Persian philosophers developed the mystical dimensions of illuminationism. Central Asian scholars explored its logical implications, and Indian Muslim thinkers integrated it with other philosophical traditions they encountered. The result was a rich and varied intellectual legacy that transcended the specific circumstances of its origin. The broader significance of Suhrawadi's execution extended far beyond the immediate history of Islamic philosophy. His death marked a crucial turning point in the relationship between rational inquiry and religious authority that would influence not only Islamic civilization, but also the broader development of medieval thought. The precedent established by his case that philosophical innovation could be suppressed through political violence would be repeated in various forms throughout the medieval and early modern periods. Yet paradoxically, Suhrawadi's death also demonstrated the ultimate futility of attempting to suppress ideas through force. The philosophical system that the Ayyubid authorities had tried to eliminate survived and flourished, influencing generations of thinkers who found in illuminationist philosophy resources for understanding reality that were unavailable through other intellectual traditions. The light that Suhrawadi had tried to kindle in human consciousness proved impossible to extinguish through external violence. In the end, the master of illumination had achieved a kind of victory that his executioners couldn't comprehend. His philosophical system had demonstrated its vitality by surviving the destruction of its creator. His ideas had proven their power by continuing to illuminate minds long after the political authorities that had condemned them were forgotten. The light of reason and spiritual insight that he had tried to cultivate in human consciousness had proved more durable than the darkness of ignorance and oppression that had temporarily overwhelmed it. The philosopher of light had been extinguished, but the light itself burned on, carried forward by countless students and admirers who understood that authentic philosophical insight possesses a kind of immortality that transcends any particular historical circumstances. His death had been intended to demonstrate the powerlessness of individual thought against established authority, but it had instead revealed the transformative power of ideas to survive persecution and continue shaping human consciousness across the centuries. Girolamo Savonarola, firebrand of Florence. Florence, in the 1490s, was a city intoxicated with its own brilliance and terrified by its own corruption. The birthplace of Renaissance humanism had become the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated city in Europe, but its very success had created moral contradictions that seemed to demand some form of resolution. In the palaces of the Medici and their rivals, ancient Greek manuscripts shared shelf space with account books recording profits from usury that the Church officially condemned. In the workshops of Michelangelo and Botticelli, Christian themes were rendered with a sensual beauty that seemed to celebrate exactly the worldly pleasures that Christianity was supposed to transcend. Into this atmosphere of magnificent decadence came Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar whose gaunt frame and piercing eyes made him appear like an Old Testament prophet transplanted into the age of Leonardo da Vinci. Born in Ferrara in 1452, Savonarola had abandoned a promising career in medicine to pursue what he saw as a higher calling, the salvation of souls, in an age when salvation seemed to matter less than artistic achievement and commercial success. The Florence that Savonarola encountered when he arrived at the monastery of San Marco in 1482 was experiencing the first symptoms of the crisis that would eventually engulf all of Italy. The Medici Bank, which had financed much of the city's cultural flowering, was beginning to show signs of the financial strain that would eventually lead to its collapse. The political system that had maintained Florence's independence was proving inadequate to deal with the new realities of European power politics. Most troubling of all, the moral authority of the Church was being undermined by scandals that reached all the way to the papal court in Rome. Savonarola's response to these crises was characteristically radical. Rather than attempting to reform existing institutions gradually, he called for their complete transformation through divine intervention. His sermons, delivered in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore to crowds that often numbered in the thousands, painted vivid pictures of divine judgment, followed by spiritual renewal. Florence, he proclaimed, had been chosen by God to lead Italy and all of Christendom into a new age of righteousness, but only if its citizens were willing to abandon their attachment to worldly pleasure and embrace lives of radical Christian simplicity. The political implications of these teachings became clear after the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492. 492 and the subsequent collapse of Medici rule, Savonarola emerged as the de facto leader of the Florentine Republic that replaced the Medici regime, attempting to implement a form of government that would embody Christian principles rather than merely serving the interests of wealthy merchants and bankers. His vision was nothing less than the creation of a city of God on earth, a political community organized according to divine law rather than human ambition. The practical measures that followed from this vision were as radical as the theology that inspired them. Savonarola organized public ceremonies where Florentines were encouraged to burn their vanities, luxury goods, secular books, cosmetics, musical instruments, and works of art that were deemed inconsistent with Christian simplicity. These bonfires of the vanities became powerful symbols of spiritual renewal, but they also represented a direct challenge to the economic foundations of Florentine prosperity. The most famous of these ceremonies, held during carnival season in 1497, saw the destruction of objects worth thousands of florins in the Piazza della Signoria. Citizens who had previously competed to display their wealth through elaborate clothing and expensive artwork now competed to demonstrate their spiritual commitment through public acts of renunciation. It was a remarkable transformation that suggested the possibility of organizing an entire society according to Christian principles rather than commercial ones. But Savonarola's political experiment was taking place within a broader context that made its long-term success extremely unlikely. The other Italian states viewed Florence's republican government with suspicion, fearing that its example might inspire similar movements in their own territories. More dangerously, Pope Alexander VI saw Savonarola's teachings as a direct challenge to papal authority, particularly the friar's claims that divine revelation could provide guidance for political affairs independent of ecclesiastical approval. The confrontation between Savonarola and the papal court revealed fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal authority. The friar argued that authentic Christian leaders had a duty to condemn corruption wherever they found it, even when it appeared in the highest levels of church hierarchy. The Pope responded that individual monks had no authority to challenge decisions made by the Bishop of Rome, regardless of their personal sanctity or popular support. The excommunication that followed in 1497 was designed to isolate Savonarola from his supporters by making it impossible for faithful Catholics to continue following his leadership. According to church law, anyone who maintained communion with an excommunicated person was himself subject to the same penalty. The decree was supposed to force Florentines to choose between their loyalty to Savonarola and their membership in the Universal Church. But the friar's response to excommunication demonstrated the depth of his conviction that divine authority superseded human institutional arrangements. Rather than submitting to papal judgment, he continued to preach and celebrate Mass, arguing that an unjust excommunication imposed by a corrupt pope had no validity before God. This position put his followers in an impossible situation. They had to choose between ecclesiastical obedience and what they believed to be prophetic truth. The political coalition that had supported Savonarola's republican experiment began to fracture under these pressures. Wealthy merchants who had initially been attracted by his calls for moral renewal began to calculate the economic costs of continued resistance to papal authority. Foreign governments that had been willing to work with Florence's republican government started to reconsider their positions when it became clear that the city's leadership was in open conflict with Rome. The final crisis came in 1498, when Savonarola's enemies organized a trial by ordeal that was designed to discredit his claims to divine inspiration. The challenge involved walking through fire to demonstrate God's favor. If Savonarola or one of his supporters emerged unharmed, it would prove that his teachings were divinely sanctioned. The trial never took place due to technical complications, but the mere fact that it had been proposed suggested that Savonarola's authority was being questioned even by some of his former supporters. The arrest that followed was swift and decisive. A mob organized by opponents of the Republican government, stormed the monastery of San Marco, overpowering the guards that had been protecting Savonarola and his closest associates. The friar, who had once commanded the absolute loyalty of Florence's population, found himself a prisoner of the same people he had tried to lead to salvation. The torture that followed was designed to extract confessions that would justify Savonarola's execution while discrediting his teachings. The methods employed were standard for the period, the strappado, which involved suspending the victim by his arms tied behind his back, and various forms of beating and burning. What made the torture particularly cruel was that it was applied to a man whose physical frailty made him especially vulnerable to such treatment. Yet according to the surviving records, Savonarola maintained his essential positions even under extreme duress. While he made various tactical admissions designed to reduce his immediate suffering, he never renounced his fundamental claim that God had called him to prophetic ministry, or acknowledged that his resistance to papal authority had been unjustified. His defiance was frail in physical terms but absolute in spiritual ones. The execution, carried out on May 23, 1498, was designed to be both a punishment and a public spectacle that would demonstrate the futility of resistance to established authority. Savonarola and two of his closest associates were hanged in the Piazza della Signoreati, same square where the bonfires of the Vanities had taken place, and their bodies were then burned to prevent the creation of martyr shrines. But the authorities' attempt to eliminate Savonarola's influence through physical destruction proved only partially successful. While his political experiment in Florence came to an end with his death, his teachings about the need for radical Christian reform continued to influence European thought in ways that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther and other reformers found in Savonarola's example both inspiration and warning about the costs of challenging established religious authority. The broader significance of Savonarola's death extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of Florentine politics. His execution marked a crucial moment in the transition from medieval to modern Europe, illustrating both the possibilities and the limitations of attempting to organize political communities according to religious principles. His fate demonstrated that prophetic vision, however compelling, could not survive without institutional support and popular commitment that proved more durable than momentary enthusiasm. Perhaps most importantly, Savonarola's career illustrated the inherent tension between spiritual authenticity and political effectiveness that would continue to challenge religious reformers for centuries to come. His absolute commitment to what he believed was divine truth had made compromise impossible, but it had also made long-term success extremely unlikely in a world where survival required the ability to navigate complex institutional relationships and competing interests. In the end, the firebrand of Florence had discovered that lighting fires was easier than controlling them once they had begun to burn. His death marked the end of one of the most ambitious attempts to create a Christian republic in Renaissance Europe, but it also established precedents for future religious and political movements that would find in his example both inspiration for their own efforts and sobering lessons about the costs of prophetic leadership in an imperfect world. Jan Hus, Truth at the Stake. The Holy Roman Empire in 1414 was experiencing one of the greatest crises in the history of medieval Christianity. For nearly 4 decades, the Great Schism had divided the Catholic Church between competing papal claimants, each asserting absolute authority while undermining the credibility of the institution they claimed to represent. The Council of Constance had been convened with the ambitious goal of resolving this crisis through the radical expedient of deposing all existing papal claimants and electing a new pope who would have universal recognition throughout Christendom. Into this atmosphere of ecclesiastical chaos and attempted reform came Jan Hus, a Czech priest and university professor whose theological writings had been creating controversy throughout Central Europe for over a decade. Hus had drawn heavily on the works of John Wycliffe, the English theologian whose radical critiques of papal authority and ecclesiastical corruption had been condemned by church authorities, but had continued to influence reformist thinking throughout Europe. The combination of Wycliffe's theological insights with Hus's own experiences of corruption in the Bohemian Church had produced a reform program that challenged some of the most fundamental assumptions of medieval Catholicism. The Prague, where Hus had developed his reformist ideas, was a cosmopolitan center that combined Germanic administrative efficiency with Slavic cultural traditions and a growing sense of Czech national identity. The Charles University, where Hus taught theology, had been founded in 1348 as the first university in the Holy Roman Empire, attracting students from throughout Central and Eastern Europe. But the university had also become a focal point for tensions between different ethnic and linguistic communities, particularly between Czech scholars who were developing increasingly critical attitudes toward German ecclesiastical authority and German faculty who remained loyal to traditional church structures. The theological positions that Hus had developed were radical enough to attract attention throughout Europe, but they were formulated with sufficient scholarly sophistication to make simple condemnation difficult. He argued that the true church consisted only of those who were predestined for salvation, rather than the visible institutional church that included both saints and sinners. He contended that papal authority was legitimate only when it was exercised according to divine law, rather than being absolute regardless of how it was used. Most controversially, he suggested that communion should be offered in both kinds, bread and winetto, lay believers as well as clergy, challenging one of the most visible symbols of clerical privilege. These teachings had obvious implications for the authority structures that governed medieval Catholicism, but they were even more dangerous because of their political context. Bohemia was experiencing growing tensions between Czech nobles, who resented German domination of key ecclesiastical positions, and German clergy, who saw Czech nationalism as a threat to the universal character of the Catholic Church. Hus's theological reforms appealed to Czech patriots because they seemed to justify resistance to German ecclesiastical authority, while German church officials viewed them as dangerous nationalism disguised as religious reform. The invitation to appear before the Council of Constance came with promises of safe conduct from Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, who desperately needed Czech support for his broader political projects. The emperor's guarantee was supposed to ensure that Hus could present his theological positions without fear of arrest or punishment, regardless of what the council might decide about their orthodoxy. For Hus, this represented an unprecedented opportunity to defend his teachings before the highest authorities of the Church and possibly win approval for reforms that could transform European Christianity. The decision to accept the invitation was controversial even among Hus's supporters. Many of his Czech colleagues understood that traveling to Constance involved enormous risks, regardless of imperial guarantees. The council was dominated by representatives of the same ecclesiastical establishment that Hus had been criticizing for years, and there was no reason to expect that theological arguments would receive fair consideration in such a politically charged atmosphere. But Hus was convinced that truth would ultimately prevail if given a proper hearing, and he saw the council as divine providence providing an opportunity to advance the cause of church reform. The journey to Constance became a kind of triumphal procession through Central Europe, as Hus was welcomed by supporters who saw him as a champion of both theological truth and Czech national aspirations. In city after city, he preached to large crowds and engaged in debates with local clergy, demonstrating the scholarly credentials and popular support that had made him such a significant figure in European intellectual life. The enthusiasm of these receptions convinced him that his ideas had broader appeal than his enemies were willing to acknowledge. But the reception that awaited Hus at Constance was very different from what his journey had led him to expect. Within weeks of his arrival, he found himself under house arrest, despite the emperor's guarantee of safe conduct. The charges brought against him were based on his theological writings rather than any specific actions he had taken, but they were formulated in ways that made defense extremely difficult. He was accused of holding heretical opinions that had already been condemned by church authorities, making it almost impossible for him to argue his case without appearing to challenge the authority of previous papal and conciliar decisions. The trial that followed revealed the extent to which theological questions had become inseparable from political considerations. The council was not simply trying to determine whether Hus's teachings were orthodox, but was also attempting to prevent the spread of ideas that might encourage resistance to ecclesiastical authority in other parts of Europe. The English representatives, in particular, were determined to condemn Hus's ideas because they were so clearly derived from Wycliffe's writings, which had already been condemned in England following the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. What made Hus's situation particularly hopeless was that the council was operating according to legal principles that made genuine theological debate almost impossible. Rather than examining his teachings on their own merits, the proceedings focused on whether they conformed to positions that had already been established by ecclesiastical authority. This meant that any defense of his ideas necessarily involved challenging previous church decisions, which was itself evidence of heretical intentions. The theological discussions that took place during the trial demonstrated both Hus's scholarly sophistication and the impossibility of his situation. He was able to cite extensive patristic and scriptural evidence for his positions, showing that his teachings had deep roots in Christian tradition, rather than being innovative departures from orthodox belief. But his judges were not interested in theological arguments about the nature of the church or the proper limits of papal authority. They were concerned with maintaining ecclesiastical unity at a time when the institution was already under enormous pressure from the ongoing schism. The emperor's attempts to fulfill his promise of safe conduct revealed the political complexities that surrounded the case. Sigismund genuinely wanted to protect Hus, both because his personal honor was at stake and because Czech support was crucial for his broader imperial ambitions. But the emperor also needed the support of the council for his own legitimacy, and the ecclesiastical authorities made it clear that they would view any attempt to protect Hus as evidence of imperial hostility to church reform. The months of imprisonment that preceded the final trial gave Hus opportunities to reflect on his situation and to correspond with supporters in Bohemia who were following the proceedings with growing alarm. His letters from this period reveal a man who understood exactly what was happening to him and why, but who remained convinced that dying for theological truth was preferable to living through theological compromise. He wrote with particular poignancy about his regret at not being able to complete his scholarly work, but he expressed no doubt about the correctness of his fundamental positions. The final demand for recantation was carefully structured to give Hus one last opportunity to save his life, while simultaneously ensuring that any recantation would be comprehensive enough to discredit his previous teachings. He was asked not simply to abandon specific theological positions, but to acknowledge that his entire approach to church reform had been misguided from the beginning. Such a recantation would have satisfied the council's need to demonstrate its authority while destroying Hus's credibility among his Czech supporters. Hus's refusal to recant was based on his conviction that authentic Christian faith required absolute commitment to what one believed to be divine truth, regardless of the personal consequences. He argued that compromising theological convictions for the sake of preserving life would constitute a fundamental betrayal of the gospel that made such preservation meaningless. His position was that it was better to die in defense of truth than to live with the knowledge that one had abandoned truth for the sake of worldly comfort. The execution by burning that followed on July 6, 1415, was designed to serve multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating Hus as a source of theological controversy. The method chosen was supposed to demonstrate the severity of his crimes while providing a public spectacle that would discourage others from following his example. The ceremony was carefully orchestrated to emphasize the triumph of ecclesiastical authority over individual resistance and the futility of challenging established church teaching. But Hus's behavior during the execution transformed what was intended to be a demonstration of institutional power into something approaching martyrdom. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, he faced death with remarkable composure, using his final moments to pray and sing psalms rather than to plead for mercy or curse his executioners. His calm acceptance of death convinced many observers that they were witnessing the persecution of authentic sanctity rather than the punishment of dangerous heresy. The immediate aftermath of the execution revealed that the council's attempt to eliminate Czech reform sentiment through spectacular punishment had achieved exactly the opposite of its intended effect. News of Huss's death provoked outrage throughout Bohemia, transforming him from a controversial theologian into a national martyr whose memory would inspire resistance to both ecclesiastical and imperial authority for generations to come. The Hussite wars that followed would devastate Central Europe for decades, while establishing precedents for religious warfare that would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation. The broader significance of Huss's death extended far beyond the immediate political consequences in Bohemia. His execution established crucial precedents for how church authorities would deal with theological dissent during the period of religious upheaval that was beginning to transform European Christianity. The pattern that emerged, initial tolerance followed by increasing pressure and eventual violent suppression, would be repeated in numerous other cases during the following century. Perhaps most importantly, Huss's fate illustrated the fundamental tensions between individual conscience and institutional authority that would define the religious conflicts of the early modern period. His claim that authentic faith required personal commitment to theological truth, even when such commitment conflicted with ecclesiastical authority, anticipated arguments that would later be developed by Protestant reformers who found in his example both inspiration and warning about the costs of religious independence. In the end, the man who had sought to reform the Church through reasoned theological argument had discovered that institutional change required more than scholarly precision and popular support. His death demonstrated that authentic reform movements needed not just intellectual coherence, but also political protection and military capability lessons that later reformers would take to heart as they attempted to avoid Huss's fate. While advancing similar goals, the truth he had died for would eventually triumph, but only after wars that made his own suffering seem like a gentle prelude to the violence that authentic religious change would require. Thomas, more a man for all seasons ends. England in 1534 was a kingdom in the midst of a revolution that few of its participants fully understood or intended. What had begun as King Henry VIII's attempt to solve a personal problem, his need for a male heir, and his desire to marry Anne Boleyn, evolved into a systematic transformation of the relationship between secular and spiritual authority that would reshape English society for centuries to come. The Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in November 1534, had declared the king to be the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, a title that represented not just a break with Rome, but a fundamental redefinition of the nature of political and religious authority. Sir Thomas More found himself at the center of this transformation, despite his desperate attempts to remain on its periphery. As Henry's former Lord Chancellor, More possessed a combination of legal expertise, international reputation, and moral authority that made his support crucial for the legitimacy of the king's ecclesiastical revolution. His refusal to endorse the royal supremacy posed a challenge that went far beyond personal disobedience. It represented a principled rejection of the entire theoretical framework that the Henrician Reformation was attempting to establish. The man who faced this impossible choice had spent his entire adult life navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor politics with a skill that had earned him the admiration of contemporaries throughout Europe. Born in 1478, More had combined a brilliant legal career with humanist scholarship that placed him among the leading intellectuals of the Northern Renaissance. His Utopia, published in 1516, had established his reputation as a social critic and political theorist, whose insights into the problems of contemporary society were matched by his ability to envision alternative arrangements that might address those problems more effectively. But More's success in public life had always been accompanied by an intense private spirituality that created tensions between his worldly achievements and his religious convictions. He had seriously considered becoming a monk before deciding that his talents could serve God more effectively in secular employment, but he had maintained, throughout his career, the kind of rigorous devotional practices that characterized monastic life. He wore a hair shirt beneath his chancellor's robes, engaged in extended periods of prayer and meditation, and approached political questions with a seriousness that reflected his belief that earthly authority was ultimately accountable to divine judgment. The crisis that would destroy More's carefully constructed balance between public service and private conscience had been building for years before it reached its climax in 1534. Henry's great matter, his attempt to secure papal annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, initially seemed like the kind of dynastic problem that skilled diplomats and canon lawyers could resolve through negotiation and compromise. More's own involvement had been limited to providing legal advice about procedures and precedents, activities that seemed well within the bounds of his official responsibilities. But as the king's frustration with papal delays had grown, the scope of his demands had expanded in ways that made neutrality increasingly impossible for his advisors. What had begun as a request for canonical proceedings had evolved into a systematic challenge to papal authority itself, culminating in the assertion that the Bishop of Rome had no legitimate jurisdiction over the English Church. This position required not just technical legal arguments but fundamental theological commitments that went to the heart of Christian ecclesiology. More's resignation as Lord Chancellor in 1532 had been his attempt to extricate himself from these developing controversies, while maintaining both his loyalty to the king and his integrity as a Catholic believer. By stepping down from his official position, he hoped to avoid having to take public stances on questions where his religious convictions conflicted with royal policy. It was a strategy that might have succeeded if Henry had been willing to accept tacit disapproval from his former chancellor, but the king's own psychological needs made such tolerance impossible. The oath of supremacy that Parliament required all office holders to swear was designed to force precisely the kind of public commitment that More had been trying to avoid. The oath required subscribers to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the Church of England and to reject any foreign authority, prince, or potentate. For More, taking such an oath would have meant repudiating the papal supremacy that he believed was essential to Catholic Christianity. But refusing it meant facing charges of treason under legislation that made denial of the royal supremacy a capital offense. The legal strategy that More adopted in response to these impossible choices revealed both his professional skill and his desperate hope that technical precision might provide escape from political persecution. Rather than publicly defending papal authority, which would have constituted obvious treason under the new legislation, he maintained complete silence about his reasons for refusing the oath. His position was that the law could not compel him to speak, and that silence could not legally be interpreted as denial of royal supremacy. This strategy demonstrated More's sophisticated understanding of English legal principles, but it also reflected his awareness that any public statement of his actual position would immediately result in his execution. He was caught between two absolute commitments: his loyalty to Henry as his legitimate king and his belief in papal authority as essential to Christian unity that could not be reconciled through any form of compromise or accommodation. The 15 months that More spent imprisoned in the Tower of London became a period of intense theological and philosophical reflection that produced some of his most profound writings. His dialogue of comfort against tribulation, composed while awaiting trial, combined practical advice about enduring persecution with sophisticated analysis of the relationship between temporal and eternal goods. His letters to his daughter Margaret revealed a man who had achieved remarkable peace about his approaching death while maintaining his characteristic humor and affection for his family. The conditions of More's imprisonment were designed to pressure him into compliance through a combination of physical discomfort and psychological isolation. He was denied access to books, writing materials, and warm clothing, while being constantly reminded that his suffering could end immediately if he would simply acknowledge the king's supremacy. The contrast between his former position as one of the most powerful men in England and his current status as a condemned prisoner was intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance to royal will. Yet the writings that survive from this period suggest that More found in his imprisonment a kind of liberation from the compromises and accommodations that public life had required. Stripped of his official responsibilities and worldly possessions, he was able to focus entirely on the ultimate questions that had always been central to his spiritual life. His approaching death became an opportunity for spiritual preparation, rather than simply a misfortune to be endured. The trial that sealed More's fate was conducted according to legal procedures that gave an appearance of justice, while ensuring the predetermined outcome. The prosecution was based primarily on testimony from Richard Rich, the Solicitor General, who claimed that More had denied the king's supremacy during a private conversation in his cell. More's defense challenged Rich's credibility and the legal sufficiency of evidence obtained through what amounted to entrapment. But the court was operating under political pressures that made acquittal impossible, regardless of legal technicalities. The most remarkable aspect of More's final trial was the speech he delivered after his conviction, when legal constraints no longer prevented him from explaining his position. He argued that the act of supremacy was invalid because it contradicted both divine law and the common consent of Christendom, making resistance to it a religious duty rather than political treason. It was the public statement of his theological position that he had avoided making for over a year, delivered only when it could no longer affect the outcome of his case. The humor that More displayed during his final weeks reflected both his natural temperament and his theological conviction that death was simply a transition to a better existence rather than an ultimate catastrophe. His jokes with his executioner, his concern for the comfort of those who came to visit him, and his cheerful letters to his family suggested a man who had genuinely achieved the kind of spiritual equilibrium that his writings had always recommended, but that few people ever actually attained. The execution on Tower Hill on July 6, 1535, was attended by large crowds who came to witness the death of one of the most famous men in England. More's final speech was brief and carefully crafted to avoid giving his enemies any grounds for posthumous criticism, while still making clear his belief that he was dying for principles that transcended immediate political considerations. His assertion that he died, the king's good servant, but God's first, captured the essential tension that had made his position impossible to maintain. The immediate aftermath of More's execution revealed the extent to which Henry's break with Rome had divided English society along lines that went far deeper than political allegiance. Catholics throughout Europe saw More as a martyr who had died in defense of Christian unity, while supporters of the royal supremacy viewed him as a stubborn traditionalist whose death had been necessary to establish England's religious independence. The controversy continued for generations, with each side finding in More's fate confirmation of their own positions about the proper relationship between church and state. The broader significance of More's death extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the Henrician Reformation. His execution established crucial precedents for how modern states would deal with individuals whose religious convictions conflicted with political requirements. The principle that the state could legitimately demand religious conformity from its citizens and could execute those who refused to comply would be applied in various forms throughout the early modern period. As European governments, attempted to enforce religious uniformity within their territories. Perhaps most importantly, More's fate illustrated the fundamental tensions between individual conscience and state authority that would define the religious and political conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. His claim that authentic Christian faith required loyalty to universal church authority rather than national religious establishments anticipated arguments that would later be developed by Catholic martyrs throughout Protestant Europe, while his emphasis on the primacy of conscience would influence later developments in theories of religious toleration and individual rights. In the end, the man who had tried to serve both God and King in a single life had discovered that such dual service was impossible when the two authorities demanded incompatible commitments. His death demonstrated that the religious revolution that was transforming European Christianity would require not just institutional changes, but personal sacrifices from those who found themselves caught between competing claims to ultimate authority. The choice between conscience and crown that had destroyed More would be faced by countless others during the turbulent centuries that followed, and his example would provide both inspiration and warning about the costs of maintaining religious integrity in an age of political transformation. Olympe de Gouges, Liberty's Guillotined Voice. Paris in 1793 was a city consumed by its own revolutionary fervor, where the noble ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were being implemented through methods that seemed to contradict the very principles they claimed to advance. The French Revolution had entered its most radical phase, with the Jacobins under Robespierre's leadership attempting to create a republic of virtue through systematic elimination of anyone deemed insufficiently committed to revolutionary transformation. In this atmosphere of ideological purity, enforced by the guillotine, even the most passionate supporters of revolutionary change could find themselves condemned as enemies of the people if their vision of reform differed from the orthodoxy of the moment. Marie Gouze, who had taken the pen name Olympe de Gouges, embodied many of the contradictions that made the French Revolution both inspiring and terrifying. Born in provincial obscurity in 1748, she had transformed herself into one of the most prominent political writers of her generation through a combination of literary talent, social ambition, and genuine commitment to the cause of human rights. Her Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, published in 1791, had extended the revolutionary principle of natural rights to include women in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender, citizenship, and political participation. The document that would eventually contribute to her execution was both a masterpiece of Enlightenment political theory and a radical challenge to the male-dominated political culture of revolutionary France. Using the language and structure of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, de Gouges had systematically demonstrated that the exclusion of women from political rights contradicted the very principles that the revolution claimed to embody. If natural rights truly derived from universal human nature rather than social convention, she argued, then those rights must belong to women as much as to men. But de Gouges' feminism was embedded within a broader political vision that put her at odds with the increasingly radical direction of revolutionary politics. She supported the constitutional monarchy that had emerged from the early phase of the revolution, believing that reform could be achieved through legal and institutional change rather than the violent social transformation that the Jacobins were attempting to implement. Her political moderation made her suspect to revolutionaries who viewed any compromise with traditional authority as betrayal of popular sovereignty. The specific positions that would seal de Gouges' fate reflected her conviction that the revolution's original ideals were being betrayed by the extremism of its current leadership. She opposed the execution of Louis XVI, arguing that mercy toward political opponents was essential to the moral credibility of Republican government. She criticized the economic policies that were impoverishing urban workers while enriching revolutionary speculators. Most dangerously, she questioned whether the reign of terror was compatible with the principles of justice and human rights. that had originally inspired revolutionary change. These criticisms put de Gouges in direct conflict with the Jacobin faction that had gained control of the revolutionary government by 1793. The Jacobins viewed moderation as a form of counter-revolution, arguing that the enemies of the people were using calls for mercy and legal procedure to undermine popular will. From their perspective, anyone who questioned the necessity of violent measures was either naive about the dangers facing the Republic or actively sympathetic to its enemies. The political atmosphere that surrounded de Gouges during her final months was one of almost paranoid suspicion, where any deviation from revolutionary orthodoxy could be interpreted as evidence of treason. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, had made criticism of government policy a capital offense, while the Revolutionary Tribunal had been streamlined to process cases with maximum efficiency and minimum attention to legal niceties. It was exactly the kind of environment where intellectual independence became a form of political suicide. The charges brought against de Gouges were carefully crafted to exploit contemporary anxieties about counter-revolutionary conspiracy, while avoiding direct engagement with the substantive political arguments she had raised. She was accused of being an agent of foreign enemies, of plotting to restore the monarchy, and of using her literary talents to spread propaganda that would undermine popular morale. The specific evidence for these charges was thin, but in the atmosphere of 1793, accusations were often sufficient to secure convictions without extensive proof. What made de Gouges' case particularly tragic was that her political evolution had been driven by the same commitment to human rights that had originally put her on the revolutionary side. Her growing opposition to Jacobin extremism reflected not a loss of faith in revolutionary ideals, but a deeper understanding of how those ideals could be perverted when they were implemented through methods that violated fundamental principles of justice and human dignity. The trial that preceded her execution was conducted according to procedures that gave an appearance of legal regularity while ensuring the predetermined outcome. The Revolutionary Tribunal was operating under enormous pressure to demonstrate its efficiency in eliminating enemies of the people, and complex cases that might require extended deliberation were discouraged in favor of swift verdicts that would maintain the momentum of revolutionary terror. De Gouges' defense strategy revealed both her political sophistication and her fatal misunderstanding of the situation she faced. She attempted to argue her case on the merits, presenting evidence that she had always supported revolutionary principles and demonstrating that her criticisms of current policy were based on concern for the long-term success of Republican government rather than sympathy for its enemies. But the tribunal was not interested in substantive political arguments, was concerned only with determining whether she posed a threat to the current regime. The speech that de Gouges delivered to the sans-culottes, who had gathered to witness her execution, demonstrated the courage and clarity of vision that had characterized her entire political career. Even facing death, she maintained her conviction that authentic republicanism required respect for individual rights and legal procedures, and that revolutionary governments that violated these principles would ultimately destroy themselves through their own contradictions.